The darkness does not leave all at once. It thins. It pulls back from the stone like a tide going out, slowly, reluctantly, leaving the walls gray and cold in the early morning air. This is the hour before the castle fully wakes, the hour when the world is still more night than day. Frost has settled on the cobblestones overnight, not a heavy frost, not the kind that silences everything under a thick white layer. A thin frost, the kind that catches on the edges of things, along the grooves between the stones, in the hollows where rainwater had gathered the evening before. In those days, the courtyard cobbles were worn smooth in the middle by decades of feet and hooves and cartwheels. But at the edges, near the walls, the stone was rougher, colder, and on a morning like this one, it held the ice longest. Stand here a moment. Just stand here and let the scene settle around you. The gatehouse is the tallest thing you can see from inside the courtyard. It rises in two thick towers of pale limestone, darkened at the base from years of mud and weather. The wood of the great gates is old, dense. The grain of it has been worn smooth near the iron fittings, where hands have touched it 10,000 times. The gates are still closed. They will not open for another few minutes yet. Up on the walkway between the towers, a figure moves. The night watchman. He has been up there since before midnight, or since some hour in the deep middle of the night, when the previous watch handed over to him. He is not young. His movements have the stiffness of a man who has been standing still for too long in cold air. He pulls his wool cloak tighter around his shoulders as he makes his way along the parapet. His breath comes out in slow white clouds. He pauses, looks out over the land beyond the walls, the fields, the tree line, the road that disappears into the gray distance. Everything is still. Everything is as it should be. He turns. He begins to descend. The staircase inside the gatehouse tower is narrow and curved. Stone steps, each one worn at the center from years of use. The edges still carry a faint ridge where the original surface remains. In those days, you learned to walk on the edges of such stairs. The center was where men slipped. He descends carefully, one hand trailing the inner wall. The stone is damp under his palm, cold in a way that goes deeper than the surface. He reaches the bottom, steps out into the courtyard, nods to the man waiting there, the gate warden, already up and wrapped in his own heavy cloak, a ring of iron keys at his belt. The two men do not speak much. There is not much to say. This exchange has happened every morning for years. The warden moves to the gates. The bolts are heavy, iron. Each one requires both hands and a certain knowledge of how to grip it, how to angle the pull so the thing moves in its housing without jamming. He has done this so many times that his body knows the motion before his mind considers it. The first bolt slides back with a low, grinding sound. Iron on iron, softened slightly by the grease worked into the fitting. The second bolt follows. Then the bar, a great length of timber that rests in iron brackets, the primary security of the whole entrance. It takes real effort to lift free. The warden exhales hard as it comes clear. He pushes. The gates swing open. The sound is deep and slow. The hinges are large and well maintained, but age is age, and there is always a low groan as the wood moves through its arc. It is not an alarming sound. It is more like a sigh. The sound of something that has been holding itself shut all night finally letting go. Cold air comes in from outside. It carries the smell of the fields, damp earth, the particular green-gray scent of grass that has been cold all night, the faint mineral smell of the road's mud. It mingles with the smell already present in the courtyard, wood ash, stone, the distant warm animal smell drifting from the direction of the stables. The light that comes through the opened gates is pale. The sun is not yet visible above the horizon. The sky to the east is a shade of gray that leans slightly toward silver, slightly toward yellow, not quite any color yet. The kind of light that makes everything look as though it exists in an earlier version of itself, quieter, less defined. Somewhere in the courtyard, a dog gets up from where it has been sleeping near a doorway. It stretches slowly, front legs extended, back arched. It shakes itself once, walks a few paces, and then simply stands, looking at nothing in particular, its tail moving in a slow, habitual wag. The fires have been banked down since last night, in the great hall, in the kitchens, in the various chambers where hearths are kept, banked, not extinguished. A good firekeeper never lets the fire go fully out. There is skill in that. There is a certain pride in it. The coals have been buried under ash through the night, holding their heat in the dark. Now, in the kitchen especially, that process is being reversed. You can see the smoke begin before you can smell it. A thin thread rising from the kitchen chimney, gray-white against the gray sky, then another from somewhere inside the hall, slow and pale at first, then thicker. Then the smell reaches you, that particular clean, sharp smell of wood smoke catching on morning air. Not the heavy smell of a full fire. Not yet. This is the smell of rekindling, of paper-thin wood shavings catching, of breath blown carefully onto coals, of the fire persuading itself back into life. This smell, in those days, was the smell of morning beginning. The first people to cross the courtyard do so quietly. A kitchen boy, maybe 12 years old, moving fast from one building to another with something tucked under his arm. A bundle of kindling, perhaps, or a cloth bundle of some foodstuff needed for the morning work. He does not look around. He has somewhere to be, and he knows the way. His feet know the particular uneven path across these cobblestones without him thinking about it. A woman crosses a few minutes later. Older, unhurried but purposeful, she carries a bucket. She is heading toward the well at the far corner of the courtyard. Her breath mists in the cold air. She pulls her shawl up over her head as she walks, adjusting it without breaking her stride. The bucket swings gently at her side. The well is covered at night with a wooden lid. She lifts it, sets it aside, lowers the bucket, the sound of the rope playing out, a steady whisper of hemp across worn stone, and then the soft plunge as the bucket meets the water below. She waits, lets it fill. The rope hangs still for a moment, then she begins to haul it back up. Arm over arm, steady, without hurrying. The bucket comes up heavy with cold water, swinging slightly, a few drops of it catching the pale light before they fall back against the stones at her feet. She lifts it clear and carries it back the way she came. The cobblestones are beginning to lose their frost now, slowly, from the inside out. You cannot see it happening exactly, but the sheen that was there a few minutes ago has started to soften. The very tops of the cobble crowns are duller now than they were. As the air moves, very slightly, with the morning wind coming through the open gates, the frost yields. It does not melt dramatically. It simply ceases to exist, one small surface at a time. The stone walls catch the light differently as the minutes pass. In those early moments after the gates open, the walls are almost colorless, pale gray, silver gray, the color of old pewter. Then, very gradually, the limestone begins to show its actual nature. It is not purely gray. There is warmth in it, a faint gold, a faint amber, present in the stone itself and waiting for enough light to make it visible. It takes time, but it comes. Along the eastern wall, where the first real light will fall, you can begin to see that shift beginning. Not warmth yet, but the promise of it. The stone is already slightly less gray there than it was. In another half hour, that same wall will be catching the full early sun, and the color it holds will be something closer to honey, closer to pale biscuit. But that is later. For now, it is the suggestion of warmth, not yet the thing itself. more movement in the courtyard now. Two stable hands emerge from the stable block, rubbing their hands together against the cold. They stand for a moment in the doorway, looking at the sky. One of them says something to the other, a few words only. The other one nods. They separate and go about their morning tasks. The horses inside will need feeding, water. The stalls will need to be cleared. There is a particular warm smell that drifts from the stable even from here. The deep, rich smell of horses and straw, and the particular dense warmth that large animals generate through a cold night. It is not an unpleasant smell. In those days, people lived much closer to their animals than we are accustomed to now. The smells of the stable were as ordinary as the smell of bread. They were part of the texture of the morning, woven in with the smoke and the cold stone and the damp of the air. A cart appears at the gate. Coming in from outside, a farmer, most likely, or someone from one of the outlying properties connected to the castle. The wheels creak and rumble over the cobblestones as the cart enters through the gatehouse. The horse pulling it lowers its head and snorts, a great rolling breath of steam. The driver sits hunched on the front board, his collar turned up, his hat pulled down. He is cold. He has been traveling since before the light came. He does not look around at the courtyard with any sense of wonder or unfamiliarity. This is a journey he makes regularly. He knows where he is going. The cart passes through and disappears around the side of the great hall toward the kitchen yard. The day is beginning. You can feel it building now, the way you can feel the change in a room when more people enter. The courtyard is not crowded, not yet, but it is no longer empty. There are people moving through it with purpose. Sound has accumulated, the creak of the well rope, the steady sound of the blacksmith's fire being built up somewhere behind the armory, not the ring of the hammer yet, just the crackle and spit of the fire finding its strength. Voices, low and occasional, a door closing somewhere. The sky is fully light now, though the sun itself has only just appeared above the horizon beyond the walls. The color has come back into everything. The gray has not disappeared entirely. It never quite does on a morning like this, when the air is cold and the season is moving toward its harder months. But it is a different gray now, warmer, inhabited. The frost on the cobblestones is almost entirely gone. The watchman who descended the tower a little while ago is no longer in sight. He has gone inside somewhere, to eat perhaps, or to sleep for a few hours before the next call on his time. He will be back on the walls by nightfall, long after the courtyard has filled and emptied and filled again through the course of the day. He will be back up on those cold stone steps, looking out at the same tree line, the same road, the same gray distance. But that is later. For now, the gates are open, the smoke is rising, the frost is retreating slowly from the edges of things, and the castle is waking up, not all at once, not with any dramatic announcement, but the way mornings have always come. Quietly, steadily, one small thing at a time. The stone came first. Before the timber, before the plaster, before the rushes on the floor, there was stone, quarried from hillsides nearby or carried slowly by ox cart from further away. Heavy, cold, and permanent. The men who built these walls were not architects in the way we understand the word. They were master masons. They worked by eye and by experience, by the memory of other buildings they had touched with their hands. They learned the weight of stone the way a sailor learns the weight of wind. Steadily, one small thing at a time. A medieval castle was not one building. It was many, layered and added to across generations, sometimes across centuries. A keep built in one era, a great hall extended in another. A new chapel added when the Lord's fortunes improved. Each addition left a seam in the stone, a place where old met new. Running your fingers along those walls, You could feel the history in the texture. Stone holds cold. This is perhaps the first thing to understand about living inside one of these structures. In summer, the walls stayed cool long after the outside world had warmed. In winter, they seemed to breathe cold inward from every surface. No matter how many fires were lit, there was always a chill at the edges. A chill that sat just beyond the firelight, patient and still. The great hall was the heart of it all, not the Lord's private chamber, not the chapel, the hall. It was where most of daily life happened, where most people slept, ate, worked, and waited. A large room with a high timber roof open to the rafters. Smoke-blackened beams above, stone flags below. The smell of old wood and old smoke never entirely left. Even in summer, when no fire had burned for weeks, that smell remained, embedded in the grain of the timber, soaked into the walls. The central hearth, in the earliest halls, sat open in the middle of the floor. No chimney at first. The smoke was meant to rise and find its way out through a small opening in the roof above. It rarely did this cleanly. More often it drifted, pooled, turned the upper air blue and thick before eventually escaping. People sitting at the high table, elevated on a dais, often found themselves at exactly the wrong height to avoid it. Their eyes watered. Their clothes held the smell for days. Later, as building knowledge grew, fireplaces were set into the walls. Proper stone chimneys drew the smoke upward and outward. The air in the hall became clearer. The walls stayed warmer, holding some of the heat from the hearth beside them. This was progress, quiet and gradual, the kind of progress that no one announced, but everyone felt. The floor of the great hall was stone, but you would rarely have seen it clearly. Rushes were spread across it in thick layers. Dried grass, dried herbs, lavender sometimes, or meadowsweet, or wormwood, which was believed to discourage insects. In a grand household, the rushes were changed regularly. In a modest one, they were left longer, growing compressed and dark at the bottom. A whole history of meals and footsteps pressed into the layers beneath. Walking through on a cold morning, you would feel the slight give of them underfoot, a softness in an otherwise hard place. Light came in through the windows, and the windows were small. Deep set in thick stone walls, they were more like tunnels than openings. In the earliest castles, they were simply unglazed. A wooden shutter could be pulled across them against rain or cold, but when it was, the light went too. The choice was always between warmth and sight, between keeping the wind out and being able to see your hands. Glass began to appear in grander buildings over time. Not the clear flat glass we know, but wavy, greenish, full of bubbles and imperfections. The light that came through it was soft and distorted. It moved strangely across the floor, bending where the glass was thicker. On an overcast morning, it gave everything a dim, underwater quality, a stillness. The hall half-lit, the corners in shadow, the high rafters completely dark. Below the great hall, in many castles, lay the undercroft. This is where we rest our attention for a while. The undercroft was a vaulted stone room, sometimes several connected rooms, built beneath the main floor above. It was not a dungeon. It was not a place of punishment. It was a place of storage, of cold preservation, of the quiet work that kept a household fed and functioning. Barrels of salted meat, sacks of grain, wheel upon wheel of dried cheese wrapped in cloth, earthenware vessels sealed with wax. In the undercroft, things were kept. The ceiling was low and curved, supported by thick round pillars of stone. Barrel vaults, some of them, with the weight of the hall above pressing down and outward, held in place by the geometry of the arch. Builders had understood this for centuries. The arch did not merely decorate, it worked. It redirected force. Stone pushing against stone, each piece held by the pressure of its neighbors. Standing in the undercroft now, or standing in one that survives, as many do, the first thing you notice is the quiet. Not just silence, but a quality of silence, heavy and enclosed. The sounds of the world above do not reach here easily. Footsteps on the floor overhead become faint thumps, distant and muffled. A voice from the courtyard is nothing. The undercroft absorbs sound the way it absorbs temperature. Candlelight in such a space behaves differently than in an open room. It does not spread far. It illuminates a small circle, the rough surface of a barrel, the curve of a pillar, the moisture beading on cold stone, and then it stops. Beyond that circle, darkness, not frightening darkness necessarily, but absolute darkness, the kind that reminds you how dependent you are on the small flame in your hand. The smell of an undercroft would have been complex. Salt and brine from the meat barrels, the faint sweetness of grain, slightly damp, the mineral cold of stone that never truly dried. And underneath it all, something earthen, the smell of deep ground, of the buried foundations beneath you, the smell of permanence. Servants would have moved through this space many times each day, carrying provisions up to the kitchens, checking the condition of stored goods. In winter, the temperature down here was more stable than anywhere above cold, but evenly cold. In summer, it stayed cool when everything else baked. This was understood, if not explained in the way we might explain it now. The builders knew what the undercroft would do. They placed it deliberately. The kitchens were placed with equal deliberateness, usually separate from the main hall or connected by a covered passage. This was partly about fire. A kitchen fire was always a risk, and keeping it away from the main structure was practical. But it was also about smell, about heat, about the constant noise and movement of food preparation. The hall was meant to feel composed, dignified. The kitchen was its own world of heat and urgency and damp steam. Between these spaces ran passageways, some wide enough for two people, some barely wide enough for one. The walls close enough to touch on both sides. Stone floors worn smooth in the center by the paths that feet always chose. A medieval castle, for all its grandeur, was also a building full of narrow corridors and awkward turns. Practicality layered over practicality, generation after generation. The staircases spiraled, almost always clockwise when ascending. This was not decorative preference. It was defensive logic. A right-handed defender coming down the stairs had his sword arm free and the central column for protection. An attacker coming up had his sword arm pressed toward the wall, his movement restricted. Every curve of that staircase was a decision about survival. The builders thought in long terms. They thought about violence, about siege, about the worst that might come. And yet, walking up one of those spiral stairs now, in a quiet castle open to visitors on a gray morning, you feel something else entirely. The stone steps have a worn, shallow depression in the center. Hundreds of years of footsteps have done this. Thousands of feet, servants carrying candles, children running, a lord in heavy boots, a woman in soft leather shoes, all of them chose the same spot on each step. The path of least resistance, the natural way up. That hollow is almost tender. It is the trace of human habit, preserved in stone. The castle was designed for war, and it was lived in gently every single day. The chambers higher in the keep were smaller than the hall, but they were warmer, more containable. A single brazier could heat a small room. Thick wall hangings kept the cold from radiating inward from the stone. Tapestries were not merely decorative, they were insulation. They held a layer of slightly warmer air between themselves and the wall. They muffled sound. They softened what was otherwise a very hard world. Windows in private chambers were sometimes fitted with cushioned seats built into the embrasure, the deep recess of the window. The wall might be 3 feet thick. The seat sat in that thickness, surrounded on 3 sides by stone, looking out through the small glazed or unglazed opening. A person sitting there was half in the room and half in the wall itself, sheltered but also elevated, closer to the outside air. In those days, such a seat was a place to read, to sew, to watch the courtyard below, a private geography within a larger one. The chapel was almost always placed high, on the upper floor of a tower or at the top of an external stair. Light was brought in more generously here than anywhere else in the building. The windows were taller, the glass, where there was glass, more carefully chosen. The builders wanted God's house to feel different from the rest, open where the rest was closed, still where the rest was busy, light where the rest was dim. Even the orientation of the chapel was considered. The altar faced east, always east, toward Jerusalem, toward the rising sun, toward the place where the day began again. In the morning, light would fall through the east window and touch the altar first. This was not accidental. The entire building, in a small way, was organized around that orientation. The masons knew which direction they were building in. They knew where the sun would travel. Outside the main buildings, the castle enclosed a courtyard. The bailey, in some castles, several. The courtyard was exposed to sky, to weather, to the full sharpness of a winter wind. Walking from the hall to the stables, from the kitchens to the well, from the chapel to the great chamber, all of this happened in the open air. There was no sheltered way between most spaces. You stepped outside and felt the cold, the rain, the particular gray of a November morning. And then you stepped back inside, and the walls closed around you again. That transition, outside to in, cold to warm, open to enclosed, must have been felt many times each day. The body would have learned it. The particular weight of a door, the sound of it closing behind you, the sudden drop in temperature the moment you stepped from the hall into the passage, the way cold stone smelled different from warm timber. These things were simply the texture of the day. The builders of these places did not think in terms of comfort the way we might, but they thought about shelter, about warmth gathered and held, about the movement of people through space and how that movement could be guided, protected, controlled. Every doorway was a choice. Every placement of a room reflected an understanding of how people lived, how heat moved, how light fell at different hours. The stone remembered all of it, long after the fires went cold, long after the last household had moved through those corridors. The walls held the shape of the decisions. The staircases held the trace of the footsteps. Thick, quiet, permanent, the stone kept everything. Below the great hall, the castle descended further into warmth. The kitchens lived in the lower parts of the building, close to the ground, close to the earth. Stone walls held the heat differently here. Not the cold storage of the upper corridors. This was a living warmth, deep and constant, the kind that settles into the skin after only a few moments inside. The fires never truly went out. In those days, keeping a flame alive was not a trivial thing. Flint and steel could restart a fire, yes, but it took time and effort, and the cook who arrived before dawn did not want to spend the first hour of morning coaxing sparks from cold ash. So the hearth was banked at night. Embers were buried beneath a careful layer of ash, insulated, preserved. By morning, a breath of air across that gray surface would show a faint orange glow underneath. The fire was still there, waiting. It had simply lowered itself to a murmur. The kitchen hearth was large, much larger than anything we might picture now. It was built to take whole lengths of wood, to accommodate iron pots that weighed as much as a small child, to radiate enough heat to warm an entire side of a stone room. The opening could be taller than a man, sometimes wide enough for 2 people to stand side by side inside the arch. Above it, the stone blackened over years and decades until it held a kind of permanent dusk, a darkness that no scrubbing ever fully removed. The smell of that room clung to everything. Wood smoke was the dominant note, not sharp or unpleasant, but heavy, layered, the kind of smoke that belongs to a place the way stone belongs to a wall. Beneath it came the smell of rendered fat, of bones long simmered, of herbs dried and hanging in bundles from the low beams above. The ceiling of a castle kitchen was rarely high. The beams were thick and dark with age. Tied to them with rough string were clusters of thyme, rosemary, dried sage, gray-green and papery, crumbling slightly at the edges when touched. The smell of bread was different from all of this. It arrived later in the morning, after the dough had been set the night before to rise slowly in a covered bowl near the hearth. Baking bread has a particular warmth to it, not just temperature, but something in the scent itself that feels like shelter. The bread ovens in a castle kitchen were separate from the main hearth. They were dome-shaped chambers of thick stone, heated by burning wood inside until the walls absorbed the heat fully. Then the ashes were raked out, the bread went in, the oven door was sealed, and the stored heat in the stone did the rest. The baker would have known the oven's temperament the way a person knows a familiar room in the dark. Every oven was different. Some ran hot on the left side. Some needed longer before they were ready. The baker's knowledge was carried in the hands and the nose, not in written measurements or timings. A handful of flour thrown into the oven would brown at a certain speed. That speed told you everything. The bread itself was dense. The loaves made for the lower household, for the servants and scullions and stable workers, were often made from a blend of grains, wheat mixed with rye, sometimes barley added in. The result was a dark, close-textured loaf with a thick crust, satisfying to hold, heavy in the hand. The finer white bread, made from sifted wheat flour with much of the bran removed, was reserved for the Lord's table. It was lighter, softer, paler, and it required more time and more expensive grain. In those days, the whiteness of bread was a mark of status, as deliberate and legible as the quality of a man's coat. The loaves cooled on wide stone shelves set into the kitchen wall. They sat there in rows, some still faintly steaming in the cool air of the room, darkening slightly on the outside as they came down to warmth from heat. A cook passing by might press a thumb briefly against one, not to break it, just to feel, to check. The crust should give a little and then hold. That was right. Alongside the bread, the pottage simmered. Pottage was the constant of the medieval kitchen. It was not a recipe so much as a method. A large iron pot hung over the fire on a chain, filled with water or weak broth, and into it went whatever was available. Dried peas, soaked overnight until they had given up their rigidity, leeks, sliced rough, onions that had been kept in dry storage since autumn, herbs taken from those sealing bundles. Sometimes a piece of salted pork, added early in the morning to give the liquid something to draw from, to give it body and depth. The pot hung at different heights, depending on how much heat was wanted. The chain could be adjusted link by link. Lower to the fire, and the pot came to a rolling boil, raised up, and it dropped to the faint, slow movement of a barely maintained simmer. The cook would have watched that pot the way a person watches something trusted, not with anxiety, but with background attention, a familiar relationship. By mid-morning, the pottage had begun to thicken. The dried peas had surrendered entirely, dissolving into the liquid, turning the broth gray-green and opaque. The smell was earthy and soft, not rich, not particularly complex, but filling, warming, the kind of thing that eases hunger without demanding attention from the person eating it. The spices were kept elsewhere. In a castle kitchen, Spices were serious things. Pepper, cinnamon, ginger, cloves, these came from long distances, across seas and through trading hands, and by the time they arrived in an English castle, they represented real money. They were stored in locked wooden boxes, small and reinforced, kept in a separate alcove or a side room off the main kitchen. The key was held by the cook or steward. It was not left lying anywhere. The boxes themselves were smooth with handling. The wood had been polished by years of being opened and closed, by hands that picked them up carefully and set them down the same way. Inside, each spice occupied its own compartment, wrapped perhaps in linen or separated by thin wooden dividers. The smell when the box was opened was immediate and intense, a warmth that was not heat, a sharpness that was not acid, something entirely its own, a pinch of pepper going into a sauce, a piece of cinnamon bark dropped into warming wine. These were not casual additions. They were measured, considered, understood as valuable. Wasting spice was wasteful in the same way wasting silver was wasteful. The cook who handled them did so with a particular care that was almost ceremonial. The kitchen in a large castle employed more people than one might expect. There were the cooks themselves, not just one, but several, each responsible for different areas of production. One might oversee the roasting of meat, managing the spit and the turning and the basting. Another might handle the sauces and the potages. The baker was often a distinct role, and then below all of them came the scullions. The scullion's life was one of perpetual motion and perpetual mess. They cleaned the pots. They fed the fire. They carried water from the well or cistern, heavy wooden buckets, the surface of the water trembling with each step. They washed vegetables in shallow stone troughs, brushing the earth off roots with rough hands. They did the continuous low-level work that a kitchen requires simply to keep running. Their hands were rarely dry. Their clothes held the smell of smoke and wet, and rendered fat long after they had left the kitchen for the night. In those days, the hierarchy of the kitchen was understood without needing to be explained. Where you stood at the hearth told you your place. What tasks you were assigned told you your place. Whether you ate in the kitchen itself or was sent with a portion to eat elsewhere told you your place. These were not resentments, necessarily. They were simply the grammar of the world as it existed, spoken in the language of fire and bread, and who held the key to the spice box. Mealtimes organized the castle day with remarkable precision. There were two main meals. The first dinner came in the late morning, often around 10 or 11 in the morning. This was the primary meal of the day, the one at which the most food was served, the one that required the most preparation. The second meal, supper, came in the evening. It was lighter, it was quieter. It marked the turning of the day toward darkness and rest. Between these two poles, the kitchen worked in a long, continuous arc of preparation. The morning was for bread and pottage, and the early work of getting broth started. The later morning was for roasting, for sauce making, for the assembly of what would appear on the high table. After dinner came the brief settling of things, cleaning, restocking, the slow resumption of tasks that dinner had interrupted. Then the kitchen eased into the gentler work of supper preparation as the afternoon light thickened and turned. The great hall above waited to receive all of this. Food moved from kitchen to table through a system of service that was careful and formal, even when it did not appear so. Dishes were carried out in procession, in a particular order. The food was arranged, presented, set before the Lord and his household, according to hierarchies that were never written down, but were observed with consistency. The cook's work did not end when the food left the kitchen. Its quality was judged at the table, and that judgment, one way or another, came back. A cook who served a lord well for years accumulated a kind of standing, not a named or titled standing, but a real one. The lord knew his name. The steward listened to his requests for supplies. His word in the kitchen carried weight. In those days, this kind of quiet authority was not nothing. By evening, the kitchen was different. The fierce energy of the midday hours had subsided. The fires were lower. The big iron pots had been emptied, scrubbed, hung back on their hooks. The scullions had carried away the waste. Supper had been sent up, and the last of the clearing was being done in a tired but unhurried way. The room still held its warmth. The walls had absorbed so many hours of heat that they gave it back slowly, radiating into the cooling air long after the fire had been brought down. The ceiling beams were invisible above. The bundles of herbs were shadows up there, their outlines barely distinguishable from the dark wood. The stone floor was worn smooth near the hearth, where feet had stood for years. In the corner, the empty bread shelves held only the faint smell of the day's baking, a warmth that was no longer heat, something between a memory and a presence. The last task before the night was banking the fire. The cook, or someone trusted with the responsibility, would rake the coals into a careful pile at the center of the hearth and cover them with ash, enough to keep the heat contained, not so much that the air was cut off entirely. It required attention, a small skill, a knowledge of how much to leave and how much to cover. Done properly, those embers would still be alive in the morning. The kitchen would never have to start entirely from cold. There was something in that act, the careful preservation of the fire through the night, that says something about the nature of the kitchen itself. It was not a place of occasional use. It was a place of continuous life. It worked all day, and it held its warmth through the night, and it woke again before the rest of the castle, because the bread needed setting, and the broth needed starting, and the rhythm of meals would not wait. The stone kept the warmth. The ash kept the embers, and the morning, when it came, would find the kitchen already breathing. By the time the kitchen had given its last hour of effort, the great hall was already changing. The light outside the narrow windows had gone from gray to amber, then amber to something deeper, a kind of bruised gold that settled over the stone like a cloth laid gently down. The torches in their iron brackets had been lit. The candles at the high table were burning, and the hall, which had been empty and echoing all afternoon, was beginning to fill. It did not fill all at once. That is not how it happened. People arrived the way warmth arrives in a cold room, gradually, in increments, almost without your noticing. A steward walked the length of the hall checking the tables. A boy dragged a bench into position. Two women came in from the far door, speaking in low voices, and took their places near the middle of one of the long trestles. The sound of the hall changed as it filled. The hollow echo softened. The air grew closer, warmer, smelling of tallow candles and the first traces of smoke from the central hearth. The hearth was the heart of it all. In those days, many great halls still burned their fires in the open center of the room. A wide, flat hearth of stone, raised just slightly from the rushes, with a hole in the roof above to let the smoke find its way out. Not all of it found its way out. Some of it drifted and pooled near the rafters, darkening the old timber. Some of it hung at shoulder height in a soft, dispersing haze that made the far end of the hall look slightly dreamlike. The smell of wood smoke in a medieval hall was not a sharp smell. It was old and deep and almost sweet, oak and ash burning slowly, doing their quiet work. Near the hearth, already settled into their favorite position, were the dogs. There were usually several. A pair of greyhounds, narrow and elegant even in sleep, had arranged themselves along the warmest edge of the stone. Their long legs were folded. Their eyes were closed. One of them exhaled a long, slow breath and did not move again. These were not the hunting dogs kept in the kennels. These were the hall dogs, the ones allowed indoors, the ones who had learned the rhythms of the evening and claimed their place by the fire as a matter of long habit. The floor around them was covered in rushes. Fresh rushes were laid out regularly, strewn across the stone flags in a thick, pale layer, sometimes mixed with dried herbs, meadowsweet, lavender when it could be had. The scent of fresh rushes was faintly grassy, faintly sweet. But rushes at the end of the day, after hours of foot traffic, carried other things too: crumbs of bread, drops of spilled ale, the general residue of a household in use. By evening, the smell was complex, not unpleasant, but lived in. The trestle tables had been set up along the sides of the hall. Long boards of rough-hewn wood rested on their supports, draped in linen where the household could afford it, bare wood where they could not. The high table sat on a raised platform at one end, a single long table set crosswise, facing down the hall. That was where the lord and lady would sit. That was where the candles burned brightest, and where the tablecloth was always clean. Seating was not casual. In those days, your place at the table told the room exactly who you were. The closer you sat to the high table, the more you mattered. Household knights and senior officials sat nearest. Lesser members of the household arranged themselves further down. Servants and lower staff took the far end, where the candlelight barely reached and the fire's warmth was already fading. Everyone understood this arrangement. It required no announcement. People moved to their places with the ease of long practice, the way water finds its level. The Lord came in without ceremony, not without dignity, but without the theatrical entrance that later stories sometimes imagined. He walked the length of the hall, spoke briefly to his steward, took his seat at the high table. The lady sat beside him. A priest or household chaplain might offer a short blessing. Then the supper began, and it was supper, not a feast. This is important. The grand feasts of legend, with their peacocks and subtleties and hundreds of dishes, belonged to special occasions: coronations, weddings, the visit of an important lord or dignitary. Ordinary evenings were something else. Ordinary evenings were a household eating together, quietly, at the end of a long day. The food came out in courses, carried from the kitchen on wooden boards and in ceramic vessels. Pottage was almost always present, a thick, slow-cooked soup of vegetables and sometimes meat, seasoned with what herbs the kitchen kept. It was the kind of dish that had been simmering all afternoon, absorbing flavor, growing richer with every hour. It arrived steaming. In winter, it was the warmest thing in the room. Bread was on every table. Dense, dark loaves for the lower tables, the trencher bread, sometimes used as a plate, soaking up sauce and juice over the course of the meal. Wider bread for the high table, made from finer milled grain. The difference was obvious, and everyone knew it. But bread was bread, and there was enough of it, and on an ordinary evening, that was what mattered. Salted meat came out. Fish on the days the church required it, dried or pickled, with a strong, briny smell that carried across the hall. In better seasons, roasted joints, still faintly crackling. Cheese, root vegetables braised in stock. Perhaps a dish of dried fruit soaked in wine, sweet and soft, served at the high table as something approaching luxury. The food was plain by the standards of a feast, but it was substantial and warm, and it was shared. Ale was poured throughout. In those days, water from open sources was not always safe, and ale, brewed weak enough for constant drinking, was the ordinary drink of the hall. It was thick and slightly cloudy, with a faintly sour, grainy smell. Not strong, not especially pleasant to a modern palate, but familiar and warming and present at every meal. Wine appeared at the high table, poured from a jug the steward kept close. The sound of supper was layered and soft, the clatter of wooden spoons against ceramic bowls, the low murmur of conversation, not loud, not animated, but continuous, like a river running quietly under everything else. Someone laughed briefly. A dog at the end of the hall got to its feet, circled once, and lay down again. A candle guttered in a draft from the far door and steadied itself. The tapestries on the walls moved in that same draft. They were heavy things, wool-woven in colors that had once been vivid, but had softened with age and smoke. Hunting scenes in most halls, forests of dark thread, figures of men and horses and dogs moving through them. In the firelight, the tapestries shifted faintly, as if the figures in them were breathing. The wool absorbed the smell of the hall over years and decades, until it carried everything: smoke, food, cold stone, candle wax, woven together into something that smelled, simply, of the place itself. Somewhere near the far corner of the hall, a musician was playing, not performing exactly, playing the way a fire burns without trying to be looked at. A guitar, perhaps, or a small harp, plucked quietly, the notes arriving and dissolving before they could fully form into something you might call a melody. In those days, music after supper was common in households that could afford a musician or that kept a servant with the skill. The music was not meant to entertain, precisely. It was meant to fill the silence without breaking it. The notes drifted over the low conversation, over the sound of eating, over the creak of the building itself, the old timbers settling against the cold outside. No one seemed to listen directly, but no one would have wanted the music to stop. The children of the household, if there were young ones of appropriate age, might sit near the high table, learning the comportment of the hall, absorbing its rhythms, watching how the lord ate, how the lady spoke to the steward, when to rise, when to be still. A great hall was an education as much as a room. Long after they had left this place, they would carry its manners inside them. As the meal wound on, the pace slowed. Second servings were finished. Bread was broken rather than eaten with purpose. Conversation loosened, became less about the day's business and more about nothing in particular. The fire had been fed and was burning well now, a deep, steady orange, giving off a warmth that reached across the stone floor and touched the edge of the nearest bench. The greyhounds near the hearth had not moved. One of them had its chin resting on the ankle of a sleeping boy who had sat down beside it and drifted off, somewhere between the soup and the cheese. The lord might speak to a senior knight for a while, leaning slightly forward, the conversation private and unhurried. The lady might take up needlework, not from obligation at this hour, but from habit, the motion of the hands carrying her through the last of the evening. Candles at the far end of the hall were allowed to burn down without replacement. The darkness gathered there slowly, without drama. Servants cleared the boards, not all at once and not quickly. The rhythm of clearing was slow, matched to the mood of the room. Dishes were carried back toward the kitchen passage. Linen was folded. The trestle tables near the walls would eventually be dismantled. Those same boards leaned against the wall each night because the hall served more than one purpose, and space would be needed in the morning. Some members of the household would sleep here. In the hall itself, on pallets of straw carried out from storage, wrapped in cloaks and rough wool blankets, arranged near the warmth of the dying fire. For many in the medieval household, this was simply where sleep happened, not in a chamber, not in a bed, but on the floor of the hall, with the embers nearby and the sound of other people breathing all around. It was not considered a hardship. It was ordinary. The hall in its sleeping hours was still a kind of company, even in silence. By now the musician had stopped. The last notes had dissolved into the room without announcement. The fire had settled from its burning peak into something lower and more constant, not flames exactly, but a deep, glowing work of coals that gave off heat without noise. The smoke rose in a slow column toward the roof hole. Outside, the night was full dark and cold. Wind moved against the stone walls without finding a way in. Candles were being snuffed, one by one, then several at once near the far tables. The hall grew darker in stages. The stone walls, which had caught and held the candlelight, gave it back more slowly than the candles themselves, a faint warm residue that lasted a breath or two after each flame went out. Then the stone returned to stone, gray and still and old. The lord and lady had retired. The steward had made his last rounds. A single candle still burned at the near end of the high table, guttering slowly toward its end. The hall was almost silent now. The breathing of sleepers near the fire, the low, continuous murmur of the coals. Somewhere above, in the old timber of the roof, a sound, a gentle creak, no more, as the building adjusted to the cold of the night. The greyhound by the fire opened one eye, found nothing worth attending to, closed it again. The candle reached its end. The flame shrank, trembled, and was gone. And the hall held what it had always held, warmth and darkness, and the slow breath of people at rest. There was one room in the castle that was always quiet, not silent exactly. Stone carries sound in curious ways, the faint drip of water somewhere in the walls, the shift of wood in cold air, the soft, almost imagined movement of air through a narrow window. But quiet, yes, in the way that some spaces seem to hold their breath. In those days, this room was the chapel, and it stood apart from the rest of the castle's life as deliberately as a pause stands apart from speech. It was usually small, not always, but usually. A modest room tucked into a corner of the upper story, or built into the thickness of the curtain wall itself. The stone here was the same stone as everywhere else, pale gray, faintly cold to the touch, carrying with it the mineral smell of deep earth and lime. But something had been done to this stone. It had been painted. In the light of a candle, those painted walls would come alive slowly. First, you would notice the gold ochre really mixed with lead and egg, but catching flame in a way that seemed more than paint. Then the deep red beneath a saint's robe. Then the blue of a sky that no one outside had ever seen, a blue that did not occur in nature, but only in this room, only in this light. The figures on the walls were flat by modern measure, but they were not empty. They watched. They had always watched. The altar stood at the far end, draped in cloth the color of whatever season the church was observing. Advent brought a deep violet. Easter brought white. Ordinary time brought green, a quiet color, a patient one. On the altar surface, a gilded cross, perhaps a small carved figure. Candles in iron holders, their wax a clean ivory color, made from beeswax rather than tallow. This was one of the distinctions of the chapel. Elsewhere in the castle, the candles smelled of rendered fat. Here they smelled of honey, faintly sweet, faintly warm, a smell that seemed to belong to another world entirely. A narrow window, usually a single one, was set into the eastern wall. In many chapels, this window held glass, not always stained, not always elaborate, but sometimes it was. A piece of deep red, a border of amber, a single blue figure in the center, no larger than a man's forearm, catching the morning light and scattering it across the floor in pieces. In those days, colored glass was a form of astonishment. People who saw it for the first time often stood very still. By morning, it fell across the stone in a pattern that shifted with the sun. A red square on the floor, moving almost imperceptibly westward. A wash of amber on the painted wall. The light here was not like light in the hall. which was practical, functional, meant for eating and working and moving through. This light was meant for nothing practical at all. It was, in some sense, the point. The chapel had its own smell, layered, accumulated over years. Incense first, though not always burning. The memory of incense, which clings to stone the way wood smoke clings to wool. Beneath that, beeswax and the specific cold of a room that receives little body heat. A faint sweetness from dried herbs, sometimes strewn on the floor. The lingering mineral quality of damp stone. And beneath all of it, something harder to name, the smell of accumulated prayer, perhaps, or simply the smell of a room that has been kept clean and purposeful for a very long time. The canonical hours structured the day. This is worth sitting with for a moment because it is so different from how time is measured now. There were no clocks on the walls. There was no bell tower visible from where you stood. Time in those days was not a quantity to be divided evenly. It was a rhythm, and the rhythm was sacred. The day had 8 hours, not hours of equal length, but named moments, each with its own office, its own prayers, its own character. Matins came first. In strict observance, it came in the darkest part of the night, well before any light. The household would rise, or some of them would, the more devout, the chaplain certainly, and move through the dark corridors to the chapel. The cold was real and immediate. Stone floors in the small hours carry a cold that rises directly through the soles of the feet. The candles on the altar were lit first. Then the small candle on the wooden stand beside the psalter. The psalter itself was a heavy thing, its pages made of animal skin so thin it seemed almost transparent, the letters formed with patience and ink that had long since dried to a deep, definitive black. The psalms were read aloud or chanted, depending on the household. In a large castle with a full chaplain and perhaps a small choir of clerks, the sound was layered, voices moving in parallel, not quite harmonizing in the modern sense, but weaving together in a way that filled the small space completely. In a smaller household, it might be only one voice. The chaplain alone, reading in the cold and the dark, with the candles and the watching saints and the colored window that would not catch any light for several hours yet. Lords followed just before dawn, then prime at the first light, terce at the 3rd hour of the day, sext at midday, none in the mid-afternoon, vespers as the light began to fail, and compline at the last, at the close of the day, before sleep. Not every household observed all 8. Many observed a smaller portion, morning prayers, an afternoon pause, evening vespers at minimum. The great religious houses were more rigorous, but even in a modest castle, the shape of the day was marked by these returns to the chapel. A bell or a horn, or simply the chaplain's knowledge of the light and the hour. The household would pause, some would come, some would not, but the hour would be observed. There is something particular about a space that is returned to again and again over the course of a single day. The chapel in the morning was one thing, cool and very still, the colored light just beginning on the floor, the smell of a new candle just lit. But the chapel at vespers was another thing entirely. By then, it had accumulated the day. The light through the narrow window was failing or had failed. The candles were the only source of warmth and glow. The wax had burned down partway. The room smelled more deeply of itself, and the people who came to it carried the day's labor in their bodies, tired, quieter, perhaps more genuinely in need of stillness than they had been in the morning. It is said that vespers was the hour when the prayers felt most like what they were meant to be. Not obligation, not ritual, or not only those things, something more personal. The light was low enough that the painted figures on the walls were half dissolved into shadow, which made them feel closer rather than further away. The psalms at this hour were about evening, about protection through the night, about the commending of something, a soul, a day, a hope, into larger hands. Long after, people would describe the feeling of Vespers in small chapels as a particular kind of peace, not happiness, something quieter than that. Compline came after, as the household prepared for sleep. This was the briefest of the offices, and in many ways the most intimate. It was said in low voices. The candles were fewer by this point. Some had been taken away to light the corridors, to light the private chambers. The remaining flames were close to the floor, warm and low. The prayers were the same every night, almost without variation. This was deliberate. Familiarity was the point. In those days, repetition was not considered dull. It was considered a form of deepening. To say the same words on a Wednesday in October as on a Monday in March was to find the same thread and follow it. The words did not change. The one saying them did slowly over years. After Compline, silence was kept. This was called the greater silence in monastic tradition, and while a castle household was not a monastery, something of that custom reached into secular life. The hour after Compline was not for conversation. People moved through the dark halls quietly. The chapel was left with a single candle burning, a vigil light before the altar, its flame the smallest it had been all day. The chapel at night, with that single flame, it is worth staying with this image. The painted saints in their flat, patient colors, the gilded cross catching the light in a way that seemed disproportionate to the single source. The open psalter on its stand, its pages slightly curved with age and use, its letters visible only as shadow at this hour. The cold that had gathered through the long afternoon, settling now near the floor. The smell of cooled wax and incense and stone and something sweet, something that was the memory of the day's prayers still present in the air. The window was dark. What had been amber and red and blue was now simply black, and the stone around it was black, and the night outside pressed gently against the glass without entering. In those days, night was more complete than it is now. The darkness beyond that window was the darkness of an unwalled countryside, of fields and forests and roads where no one moved. But here, inside the chapel, the vigil candle held. It was the chaplain's particular role to maintain this space. He kept the candles. He knew when supplies of beeswax were running low. He ordered the incense, a substance that came from very far away, from resin trees in warm, dry places that no one in the castle would ever visit. He cared for the psalter, keeping its pages smooth, replacing the ribbons used to mark the day's readings. He knew the names of the saints painted on the walls, their stories, the days that belonged to each of them. He was, in a practical sense, the keeper of time. The household oriented itself by his bell, his voice, his presence at the chapel door. But the chapel did not belong to him alone. It belonged to everyone in the castle in different ways. The Lord and his family had designated places, often closer to the altar. The household servants might stand at the back, or in a small adjoining space separated by a wooden screen. A woman giving birth in the castle might have a candle lit before a particular saint. A dying man might be brought here, or the priest might come to him, carrying the consecrated elements from the altar outward through the dark corridors. The chapel was the fixed point around which the household's spiritual life moved, and like all fixed points, it gathered weight over time. Some chapels accumulated small offerings, a ring placed on the altar, a twist of hair bound with thread, a small wooden figure worn smooth by handling. These things were not always encouraged by the more orthodox, but people left them anyway. In those days, the line between religious observance and something older, something more private, was not always clearly drawn. The painted walls absorbed all of it. The prayers said clearly, and the ones said in a whisper. The days when the light through the window was brilliant and the floor was covered in moving color. The days when rain streaked the glass and the light inside felt like the only light in the world. The mornings of matins in the deep cold. The evenings of vespers with the candles low and the voices quiet. Long after the people who had prayed here were gone, the stone would hold the cold and the smell of wax and the faint color of pigment on the walls. This was the room that marked time. Not the kitchen, not the hall, not the battlements where a guard watched the road. Here in the small and painted space, with the colored window and the open psalter and the candle that burned even through the night, here, time was not measured but honored. Each hour given a name, each day given a shape. Each life, however briefly, given a place to be still. The vigil flame held through the dark, as it had the night before, as it would the night after, small and steady and entirely itself. There was a door in the wall, small and set low, the kind of door you might pass a dozen times before noticing it was there. Beyond it, the garden waited. Not a grand garden, not the sweeping pleasure grounds that later centuries would imagine for their castles. This was something quieter and older and more useful. A garden grown close to the stone, tucked inside the outer ward, or pressed against a south-facing wall where the sun could linger longest. A place that smelled of warm earth and cut stems, of lavender drying in the heat, of something green and faintly bitter that you could not quite name. In those days, a garden was not a luxury. It was a necessity dressed in beauty. The herbs grown here fed the kitchen and the infirmary both. They flavored the pottage and eased the fever. They were hung to dry in bunches from the rafters of the stillroom, stored in clay pots, steeped in oil, pressed between linen. A garden like this was tended with the same seriousness as the granary or the well. It was not decorative, but it was, despite everything, lovely. Step through that low door and the world changes slightly. The sounds of the castle, the distant clang of the smithy, the movement of horses, the voices carrying across the courtyard, they do not disappear, but they soften. The walls hold them back a little. And what fills the space instead is a different kind of sound entirely. The slow hum of bees, the dry rustle of lavender in a faint breeze, a sparrow somewhere, close and unhurried. The paths between the beds are laid with flat stone, worn smooth. They are narrow enough that your skirt or your sleeve would brush the herbs on either side as you walked. That was not accidental. You were meant to brush against them. The oils would release. The scent would follow you. It was one of the small, deliberate pleasures of a place that understood how pleasure worked. The beds themselves are raised, timber-edged, or sometimes faced in stone. The soil inside them is dark and well-worked, amended with ash and rotted madder, generations of care pressed into it. You can see the furrows where someone has crouched and pulled and turned the earth with their hands. In late summer, the beds are full, crowded almost. The plants have grown into each other, reaching toward the light. Here is rosemary, woody at the base, its thin leaves silver green in the afternoon sun. Run your thumb along a stem, and the scent comes strong and sharp, almost medicinal, the kind of smell that wakes something in the back of the head. Rosemary was used for everything: roasting meat, strewing on floors to sweeten the air, burning at the edges of a sick room. It was said to strengthen the memory. In those days, that was not a small thing. Beside it, sage, broad-leaved and dusty, the texture of it slightly rough under the fingertip. Sage grew low and wide, spreading if you let it, and in summer it put out small purple flowers that the bees loved. It was used in cooking, yes, rubbed into pork, stirred into stuffings, but also in medicine. A wash of sage was thought to clean wounds. A tea of it was given for sore throats. The line between kitchen herb and healing herb was always permeable. The cook and the herbalist often traded knowledge. Further along the path, mint. It grows differently from the others, faster, more aggressive, spreading underground if it can. It would take over a bed if left unchecked, so it was often planted alone or contained. In August, it is at its most fragrant, the leaves glossy and deep green, releasing their cool, sharp scent at the slightest touch. A sprig of mint in a cup of hot water, a handful crushed and rubbed on a cloth. The smell of it is clean in a way that few things in the medieval world were permitted to be. There is feverfew with its small daisy-like flowers. Chamomile, low to the ground, releasing a smell like warm apples when you walk across it. Yarrow, with its flat heads of white flower and its deeply cut leaves, grown for poultices and for the stanching of wounds. Hyssop, which was used in cooking, but also for ritual, for the blessing of sick rooms, for the cleansing of things that needed cleansing. Each plant had its character, its particular usefulness, its particular smell. The person who tended this garden knew all of it. She, and it was often a she, a woman of the household, or a nun in those castles near a religious house, or sometimes a senior servant with inherited knowledge. She moved through the beds with the ease of long familiarity. She knew which plants were ready to cut and which needed another week. She knew that the rosemary at the south end had grown too woody and would need hard pruning before winter. She knew that the chamomile was seeding itself into the path again, and that this was, in its way, a kind of gift. Her knowledge had not come from a book. Most of it had not. It had come from watching, and from being taught by someone who had also watched. Some of it had been written down. There were herbals, manuscripts with careful illustrations and careful Latin, copied in monasteries and passed between households. But the book was always secondary to the hand and the eye, to the smell, to the particular quality of a leaf crushed between thumb and forefinger. Against the south-facing wall, the fruit trees. They are trained flat against the stone, their branches spread wide and tied back at intervals, the method we now call espaliering. In those days, it had other names, or no name at all. It was simply how you grew a fruit tree against a wall if you wanted it to thrive. The stone absorbs the sun's heat through the day and gives it back through the night. The tree growing against it is warmer than it would otherwise be. In a northern climate, in a short season, this was the difference between fruit and no fruit. In late summer, the apples are swelling on the branch, still hard, still green toward the core, but beginning to flush with color on the side that faces out. A pear tree further along is further ahead, its fruit already rounding into that particular heavy shape. You could press your thumb gently against a pear and feel it give, just slightly, and know from that small yielding whether it was ready to come down. Some of the fruit would be eaten fresh, at the Lord's table, a luxury in those months when fresh fruit was abundant and briefly plentiful. More of it would be stored, packed in straw in cool cellars, or dried, or pressed into juice that would be left to ferment slowly through the autumn into something warming and faintly sweet. Nothing was wasted. A fruit tree against a warm wall was a significant asset, tended carefully across many years, perhaps longer than any single person's memory of the household. The bees. There is a corner of the garden where the light falls differently, where it seems to gather and pool. This is where the skeps stand, 3 of them, perhaps 4, depending on the season and the year. They are made of twisted straw, coiled and stitched into domed shapes, each one sitting on a flat stone, slightly raised from the ground. They are worn smooth where they have been handled. They have the look of things made by patient hands, made to last. The sound near the skeps is layered. It is not one sound. It is thousands of sounds braided together so tightly they become one. A low, warm, continuous hum that you feel slightly in the chest before you properly hear it. It is, once you have stopped being afraid of it, one of the most soothing sounds the natural world makes. Something about its steadiness, something about the life in it, organized and purposeful, going on without asking anything of you. Bees in those days were kept for two things above all others: honey and wax. Honey was the primary sweetener in a world that had no refined sugar, or had it only as a rare and expensive import. Everything sweet, the spiced wine, the festive pastries, the medicines mixed to make them palatable, was sweetened with honey. A hive was a productive thing. A well-managed skep could yield several pounds of honey in a good year, dark and fragrant, tasting of whatever the bees had found to visit. In a garden like this, where lavender and rosemary and thyme grew in abundance, the honey would carry their flavor lightly and unmistakably. The wax was almost as valuable. Beeswax candles burned cleaner and brighter than tallow. They did not smoke as badly. They smelled better, a warm, faint sweetness when the flame first caught. In a castle where the great hall required many lights and the chapel required still more, wax was always in demand. The skeps in the garden contributed to the light of every room in the building. In this way, the garden and the castle were continuous. The boundary between them was not a hard one. Late afternoon now. The sun is dropping toward the western wall. The shadows of the wall are beginning to reach across the path, and where they fall, the air is noticeably cooler. The herbs at the shadow's edge have a different quality in this light. The silver in the rosemary more pronounced, the lavender flowers almost gray. But where the sun still holds, everything is warm and slightly heavy-looking, the way plants look at the end of a long August day when they have been in full light for hours. The lavender is nearly finished. A few weeks ago, it was at its height, the whole bed a purple-blue cloud of flower, so dense with bees that you could hear the garden from 50 feet away. Now the flowers are drying on the stem. Some have already been cut and bundled. The dried bunches will be tucked into linens, pressed into the folds of stored cloth, placed in corners where the air needs freshening. The smell of dried lavender is different from fresh, quieter, more powdery, less sharp. It is the smell of things put away carefully, of preparation. There is a bench here somewhere. Stone, most likely, or perhaps a simple timber frame. It faces south, catching the last of the warmth. Whether anyone is sitting on it at this moment is a matter of circumstance, but it was placed there with intention. It was placed there because someone understood that the garden needed to be rested in, not only worked in. That sitting in a warm garden in late summer, listening to bees, watching the shadow move across the herbs, that this was not idleness, that it was its own kind of necessary thing. Centuries before anyone would have used the word for it, there was an understanding that green quiet had value, that the body needed it, that the mind, particularly a mind burdened by the management of a household, or by illness, or simply by the accumulated weight of days, would benefit from sitting still in a place that smelled of rosemary and warm stone. The herbalist knew this if she sat on the bench at the end of her work. The lady of the household knew it if she walked here in the morning before the day's demands arrived. The infirmary attendant who gathered herbs by hand knew it in the particular way that physical work in a garden teaches you, the knowledge that comes up through the knees, through contact with the earth. Long after the castle itself had fallen to ruin or been rebuilt or been repurposed into something unrecognizable, these plants would sometimes persist. Rosemary growing wild in a corner where a wall had once stood. Chamomile receding itself, season after season, into the rubble, the herbs outlasting the stone in their quiet way. But that is later, that is long after. Now the sun is still on the bench. the bees are still working. There is a smell of warm lavender in the air, and beneath it, something earthier turned soil, stone that has held heat all day, the green sap smell of crushed mint from where someone brushed past the bed. The hum continues, low and even and entirely indifferent to the hour. The shadow is moving, slowly and then a little faster, the way all things move when you are still enough to watch. Below the great hall, below the solar and the chapel and the Lord's private chambers, there was another castle entirely. It ran on different hours. It smelled of different things. And the people who lived inside, it left almost no trace in the written record, only the faint outline of their labor pressed into the stone like a hand into warm wax. They were the ones who made everything work, not the knights, not the lord, not the lady with her embroidery and her careful correspondence. The ones who made everything work were the steward checking his tallies by candlelight, the pantler lifting a loaf from the bread store before dawn, the ewerer hauling water up a narrow stair that smelled of damp and cold iron. Their names mostly are gone. Their days mostly were the same, and yet without them, the castle, all that stone and timber and ceremony, would have ground to silence inside a week. This is their chapter. The steward arrived at his work early. In those days, the running of a large household was an exercise in sustained arithmetic. The steward was responsible for every ledger, every supply, every bill of purchase, and every mouth that needed feeding. He kept accounts on long rolls of parchment, writing in a hand that was small and practiced, the ink made from oak gall and iron, the letters pressed close together to save space. The parchment itself was expensive. Nothing was wasted. His room, if he had one to himself, would have been near the hall, close enough to hear if something went wrong. He would have worked by a single tallow candle in the morning hours, the flame giving off a faint smell, not quite smoke, not quite fat, something between the two. The light it threw was yellowish and warm. It caught the edges of his writing, but left the corners of the room in soft gray shadow. He tallied grain. He tallied salt. He noted how much wine had come up from the cellar and whether the figure matched what was poured. He tracked the comings and goings of visitors, because visitors needed beds and food and fodder for their horses, and all of that had a cost. The steward understood, better than almost anyone else in the castle, what things actually cost. In a large household, he might have had clerks beneath him, young men with ink-stained fingers and quiet dispositions, trained to copy and add and carry numbers forward from one column to the next. They would have worked alongside him in near silence, the scratch of their quills a steady sound, like rain on thatch, even and unremarkable and somehow restful. Lower still in the hierarchy of the household, the work became more physical, more immediate, more tied to the body and its needs. The pantler was responsible for bread. This sounds simple. It was not. Bread was the center of every meal. It was the plate and the food at once, broad, flat trencher loaves set beneath the meat, soaking up juices, eaten afterward or given to the poor at the castle gate. The pantler oversaw the bread store, counted the loaves, checked for mold, managed the distribution with the kind of quiet authority that came from knowing exactly how much there was and exactly how much was needed. He would have carried bread in cloth or in a flat-sided basket with handles worn smooth by years of use. The loaves themselves were dense and dark if they were made from rye, lighter and softer if wheat, though wheat bread at a lord's table was not something the pantler likely ate himself. He knew the texture of both. He knew the smell of bread that had turned slightly overnight, that faintly sour edge, almost alcoholic, that told you it needed to be used today. The ewerer carried water. That was the whole of it, and it was never finished. Water for the Lord's morning washing. Water for the kitchen. Water for the laundry, carried in wooden buckets that left damp rings on the stone floor wherever they were set down. The ewer might also have been responsible for the linen towels used at table, the long white cloths, kept clean and folded, that guests dried their hands on between courses. In a formal household, this was considered an honorable enough task. The care of clean linen was not nothing. It was visible. It was noticed when it went wrong. But most of the work was the water. Back and forth from the well, or from the cistern, or from the stream below the walls on days when the well ran low. The buckets were heavy when full. By afternoon, the ewer's arms would have ached in that deep, dull way that is almost below pain, the feeling of muscles that have simply been used too long. And there were others, dozens of them in a large castle, each with a particular task that fit into the hole the way a stone fits into a wall. The alewife who managed the brewing, the chandler who made and kept the candles, tallow for daily use, beeswax for the chapel and the Lord's chamber, the beeswax ones burning cleaner and longer, and with a sweetness that you noticed only after you had left the room. The laundress, her hands red from the lye water, her breath fogging in the cold of the washing yard. The ushers who stood at doors and managed who came in and who waited. Each of them moved through the castle on their own particular paths. They learned the geography of it the way you learn a body, not by looking at it, but by living in it, by walking the same passage in the dark, and knowing without counting exactly how many steps to the corner. By late afternoon, the work was changing shape. The urgent tasks of morning had settled into the slower work of preparation, preparing the hall for the evening meal, preparing the stables for the night. It is the stables we find ourselves in now as the light begins to fail. The last of the sun comes in low through the stable door, long and amber, catching the dust in the air. The dust is made of straw and hair and dried earth, and it moves slowly, drifting upward toward the beams where the swallows nested in summer and were now, in the colder months, gone. The swallows' empty nests are tucked into the shadows up there like small gray cups. The horses are settling. You can hear it, the shift of weight, the slow rhythmic breath, the occasional soft knock of a hoof against the packed earth floor. They have been fed and watered. Their coats have been brushed until the stiff bristles of the curry comb worked out the sweat from the day's work, and the hair lies flat and dark now along their necks and flanks. The groom moves through the stable with the unhurried calm of someone who knows this place completely. He is perhaps 16, perhaps 30. The light makes it difficult to say. He checks each horse in turn, running a hand along a flank, checking a leg for heat or swelling, pausing at one stall where a mare has been uneasy all day. He speaks to her in a low voice, not words exactly, more the shape of words, a murmur that has no content but carries something nonetheless. She shifts, settles. He lifts a bridle from a peg near the door and carries it to an iron hook on the far wall. The leather is old and has been worked with fat to keep it supple. It smells of the horse and the fat together, an animal smell, deep and not unpleasant, the smell of work honestly done. He hangs it carefully, the metal bit resting against the hook, and for a moment he just stands there. His hands hang at his sides. He is not thinking of anything in particular, or perhaps he is thinking of everything at once in that unfocused way that comes when the body is tired. The lantern on the post throws a circle of warm light. Beyond it, the stable is all soft dark and the sound of breathing. In those days, a groom's life was spent almost entirely with animals. He slept near them in some households, on a pallet in the tack room, or in a small space above the stable where the hay was stored. The warmth of the horses rose through the floor in winter, a slow, ambient warmth, not sharp like a fire, but steady and even, the kind that settles into the bones without you noticing until you step outside and feel the cold again. He knew each horse by temperament and habit. He knew which one needed to be bridled last because it spooked at the sound of the others. He knew which one had a tendency to colic in cold weather and needed to be watched. This knowledge was not written down anywhere. It lived in him, and when he moved on or died or grew too old for the work, it went with him, and someone new had to learn it from the beginning. This was the nature of most knowledge in the castle. It was embodied. It was passed from hand to hand by demonstration, by watching, by doing the same thing wrong a few times before you understood how to do it right. The steward might write things in his ledger, but the groom carried his learning in his hands and his feet, and the flat of his palm laid against a horse's warm neck. Centuries before anyone thought to write histories of servants and grooms, their work was simply understood as part of the texture of the world, not celebrated, not particularly noticed. Present the way the floor is present, taken for granted until it is not there. Long after the castle fell quiet for the night, the stable would still carry the small sounds of the horses, the breath, the shift, the occasional deep exhalation that is almost a sigh. The groom, if he lay down nearby, would fall asleep to those sounds. They were the sounds his nights were made of. Outside, the castle was completing its long daily turn. The kitchen fires were being banked. The hall would be cleared of the last of the evening meal. The trestle tables folded and leaned against the wall. The rush lights pinched out one by one. The servants who had moved through the whole of the day, up before light, still working as the stars came out, were finding their places to rest. Some slept in the hall itself, wrapped in cloaks on the floor near the embers. Some had small rooms in the outer buildings, barely large enough for a bed and a peg for a coat. Some, like the groom, slept where they worked, in the quiet company of the animals and the straw and the lingering warmth. They did not leave behind letters or diaries or portraits. What they left behind was the castle itself, clean, supplied, functional, fed. The ledgers the steward kept, the well-worn paths between the kitchen and the hall, the iron hook on the stable wall where a bridle has been hung 10,000 times by 10,000 different hands. The work was not glamorous. It was not the stuff of ballads. It was the getting of water, and the counting of bread, and the brushing of horses, and the carrying of clean linen to a table where someone else would sit. It was the keeping of a fire in a hearth that was not yours. The making of a bed you would never sleep in. It was steady. It was daily. It was, in the way that all necessary things are quietly enormous. And now the stable is nearly dark. The lantern still burns, small and orange, at the far end. The horses are still. The straw is warm underfoot. The groom has settled somewhere in the dim space at the edge of the light, his breathing slowing to match the breathing of the horses around him. The castle above is quieter now. The sounds of the day are withdrawing, one by one, like water pulling back from a shore. What remains is the soft dark, and the warmth, and the slow, easy breath of animals at rest. Winter came into the stones slowly. That was the particular cruelty of it. Not all at once, like a storm you could brace against, but gradually, a degree colder each morning, a little more gray in the light, until one day you noticed the water in the basin had a thin skin of ice across it, and you understood that the season had fully arrived. Stone holds cold the way it holds nothing else. A fire might burn in a room for hours, and still the wall at your back would carry the chill of the air outside. The castle in winter was two worlds pressed against each other, the narrow, warm world of the fireplace and everything beyond its reach. To step away from the hearth was to feel winter immediately, not violently, just steadily the way cold always works, patient and thorough and everywhere. The tapestries helped. In those days, fabric on stone walls was not decoration in the way we might think of it now. It was survival. Heavy wool hangings, some of them woven with hunting scenes or patterns of foliage, were pinned or hooked against the walls throughout the cold months. They trapped a thin layer of air between the wool and the stone. That air could be warmed. Bare stone could not really, not to any depths that mattered. The tapestries moved very slightly in drafts, a slow breathing motion, and the figures woven into them, the deer, the mounted riders, the distant hills, seemed almost alive in firelight. Furs were layered over everything. On beds folded over chairs, hung on iron pegs near the doorways. Wolf, bear, fox, sheepskin, they smelled of lanolin and of the animals they had come from, and in the warmth of a room that smell was very present. Not unpleasant, exactly. Rich and animal and real. By midwinter, it became simply the smell of being indoors, inseparable from the scent of wood smoke and tallow and the faint sweetness of stored apples somewhere below. The days were very short. In the depths of winter, at the latitudes where many of these castles stood, full daylight might last no more than 7 or 8 hours, and it was rarely bright daylight, more often a flat gray illumination that came in through the narrow windows and reached only a little way into the room before it gave up. The windows themselves were small by design, a concession to defense and to the cold, and even those with oiled linen or thin horn panes let in only a dim and diffuse light. Snow outside made things slightly brighter. On clear days with snow on the ground, the reflected light could be startling, but clear days were not common. Cloud and mist and the low flat gray were more usual, and by mid-afternoon, the candles had to be lit. This was perhaps the detail that most shaped the texture of a winter day. The candles coming on at 3 in the afternoon, sometimes earlier. Tallow candles, mostly, made from rendered animal fat. They gave a warm and slightly yellow light. They smoked a little, and they smelled, a faint fatty smell that was always present in winter interiors, layered beneath everything else. Beeswax candles burned cleaner and brighter, but they were expensive. The great hall and the lord's private rooms might have them on important occasions. Most of the castle made do with tallow and learned to see by its softer light. Iron candle holders stood on tables and shelves. Simpler ones were just iron spikes mounted on a weighted base, and the candle was pressed down onto the spike to hold it. Others had cups to catch the dripping fat. The fat dripped anyway, onto tables, onto the rushes on the floor, adding its own small contribution to the layered smell of the room. In those days, this was not noticed as unpleasant. It was simply what winter evenings smelled like. The warm, slightly greasy, smoky air of a room lit by fire and tallow. The great hearth in the hall was the heart of everything. In the coldest weeks, it burned almost continuously. Servants were responsible for the fire, banking it at night so that embers remained, feeding it again before dawn, carrying the heavy logs in from the wood store. The wood store itself was a matter of serious concern. Fuel for a winter was calculated in autumn, stacked and counted. A hard winter, a long cold spell, could exhaust a supply that had seemed adequate. In those days, running short of firewood was not a minor inconvenience. It was dangerous. The logs burned slowly in that large hearth, and the fire had a particular sound at its steadiest. A low, continuous settling, punctuated by the occasional pop or shift of wood. Sparks rose now and then and died before they reached the smoke-blackened stone of the chimney breast. The warmth from a fire that size was significant but uneven. Your front was hot, your back was cold. You turned instinctively like everyone else in the room. The household drew together in winter. This was not sentimental, it was practical. Fewer rooms were heated. People clustered into those that were. The Great Hall, which in other seasons was a place of business and ceremony and noise, became something more intimate in winter. More people slept closer to the fire. The divisions between ranks, always present, became slightly softer simply because warmth was scarce and shared. The kitchen was another warm place, and servants found reasons to be there that had nothing to do with food. Food itself had changed. Oram's slaughter had filled the salt barrels. Fresh meat was rare now. What came to the table was preserved, salted beef, salted pork, dried fish, smoked things. Spices were used heavily, partly for flavor, partly because they were expensive and their use signaled status, and partly because heavily salted meat needed something to work against it. Pepper, ginger, cinnamon, cloves. The smell of these in a kitchen was warm and sharp and almost medicinal. Dried peas and lentils were staples. Bread made from last autumn's grain, hard cheese. The apples and pears that had been stored on shelves in the undercroft, those that had not already softened and rotted. You could tell the season by the taste of them, slightly dull now, the brightness of October long gone, but still sweet enough to matter. Hot drinks were important. Ale was warmed by plunging a heated iron rod into the cup. It hissed and steamed, and the ale came away slightly caramelized at the edges, warm all the way down. Wine was heated with spices. On cold mornings, something hot in the hands was not a luxury. It was a way of starting the body again, reminding it how to be warm. The inner well sometimes froze. Not deeply, not always, but a crust of ice on the water was not unusual in the hardest weeks. Someone would break it with a long pole or a stone. The water drawn up was very cold, cold enough that your hands ached holding the bucket. People learned to carry water quickly, to pour it into containers near the fire, to take the worst edge off before washing. Cold water on cold skin in a cold room was something you did not linger over. Washing happened faster in winter. Bathing happened rarely. Children in the castle, the pages, the younger servants, the Lord's own children, if there were any, stayed very close to fires and were wrapped in so many layers that they moved with a certain stiffness. Small hands stayed cold anyway, despite everything. You can dress a child in wool from wrist to neck, and their fingers will still be cold by mid-morning. This has always been true. In those days, it was simply accepted. Cold fingers were part of winter. You held them near the fire until they ached coming back to warmth, and then you carried on. The animals were still present in the castle's lower levels. The horses in their stables, the dogs near the fires, the chickens that had been moved inside. Their body heat was not insignificant. A stable full of horses is a warm place, warmer than you might expect, simply from the living warmth of large bodies and the deep beds of straw. Grooms slept in the stables partly because it was their duty, and partly because in winter it was one of the warmer places in the whole building. Dogs pressed themselves to the fire with a complete lack of self-consciousness. They turned slowly, like everyone else. Sometimes they singed their fur slightly, and the smell of it, sharp and brief, would drift across the room. No one remarked on it. It happened every winter. The dogs didn't seem to mind. Snow fell outside, and inside the windows it was visible only as a narrow rectangle of white. Through the thick walls, sound was already muffled. Snow muffled it further. The world outside became very quiet. Footsteps on the battlements were soft. The usual sounds of the yard, horses, voices, the rattle of cartwheels on stone, were softened and slowed. It was said that in a heavy snowfall, the castle felt more like itself, more self-contained, the connection to the outside world temporarily dissolved. Night came early. By 4 o'clock, or even before, The grey light outside the windows had gone entirely. The interior of the hall existed then in a world entirely of its own making, firelight and candlelight, the smell of smoke and tallow, the low murmur of conversation, the occasional crack of the fire, the shifting of a dog. The cold outside was total and complete. In here, warmth had been earned and maintained and shared, and its value was felt in a way that is difficult to appreciate in other seasons. People spoke more quietly in winter, or perhaps the rooms seemed quieter because the outside world had withdrawn. The usual busyness of the castle, the arrivals and departures, the traffic through the gates, the messengers, the traders, the movement of the household between buildings, all of that slowed. Travel was hard. Roads were mud and ice. Visitors came less often. In deep winter, a castle household might go many days without anyone arriving from outside. This could feel like peace. It could also feel like something else, a kind of stillness that had weight to it. Long evenings were filled with what they had always been filled with: conversation, stories, music when there was someone to play, needlework by firelight, though the light was never quite good enough, and eyes strained after a while. Games were played, dice, simple board games, contests of memory and word. In those days, the long evening was not something to be escaped. There was nowhere to escape to. You settled into it, the way you settle into a warm bath, and let it be long. The fire needed tending through the night. Someone always woke for it, or someone stayed up with it. There was a particular feel to a castle in the deep hours of a winter night. The fire lower, the candles out, just the glow of embers in a dark room, and the cold pressing in steadily at every wall. The sleepers under their furs, breathing slowly. The dogs closer to the hearth now, filling the space as the humans pulled back into sleep. Outside, the snow went on falling, or it had stopped, and the cold had hardened everything into stillness. The walls of the castle held. They had been built for exactly this, to hold against everything outside, the cold as much as anything else. Stone is slow to warm and slow to cool, and by deep night, the walls had given back what small warmth the day had given them, and now they were cold stone again, patient and solid and permanent. Inside, the fire breathed. The furs lay heavy on sleeping bodies. The tapestries moved almost imperceptibly in some small draught from under a door. The smell of the room was wood and wool and tallow, and the faint animal warmth of people and dogs, all drawing from the same source of heat. The night was very long. In those days, winter nights were always long, and the warmth, small as it was something, a thing made and maintained against the dark, against the cold, against the long season pressing in through every crack in the stone. There was a room in most castles that most people never entered. It sat near the kitchen gardens or off a quiet corridor away from the great hall. The door was low, the ceiling too, and when you stepped inside, the smell reached you before anything else. Dried lavender, something earthy beneath it, roots and bark, a faint bitterness like old wood but warmer. The smell of a place that had been used carefully over a long time by someone who knew what they were doing. This was the still room, or the apothecary's corner, or simply the healer's space. The name changed from castle to castle, but the purpose was always the same. In those days, illness was a serious thing. There were no hospitals in the modern sense, no swift remedies, no certainty. A fever that would be managed easily today could take a person in a week. A wound that became infected was a slow and frightening prospect. People knew this. They lived with this knowledge the way we live with weather, as a constant background presence, shaping decisions, shaping habits, shaping the way they stocked their shelves. So the shelves were stocked with care. Bundles of dried herbs hung from the ceiling beams, tied with rough cord, swaying gently when the door opened. Chamomile, rosemary, wormwood, bitter and gray-green. Valerian, with its strange, almost unpleasant smell, damp and heavy, like turned earth after rain. Each bundle had been harvested at a specific time. The apothecary knew when to cut. They knew which part of the plant carried the most strength. The root in autumn, the flower just before it fully opened, the leaf in the dry weeks of summer before the heat had drawn out all the moisture. This was knowledge passed down carefully. Some of it came from manuscripts, some of it came from watching. The manuscripts themselves were remarkable things. A castle with any pretension to learning might possess a copy of Dioscorides, a Greek physician whose plant knowledge had been moving through the medieval world for centuries, copied and recopied, annotated in margins by monks and healers who had tested the old claims against their own experience. Some pages were illustrated, precise, careful drawings of roots and stems. The ink, in certain light, still warm-looking, like someone had been writing at that very table only a few hours ago. Beside the manuscripts, a candle would usually be burning. The room was often dim. The windows were small, set with thick greenish glass that softened the light into something underwater, gentle, diffused. In the mornings, when the sun was low, this light would move slowly across the shelves, catching the ceramic jars, wide-bellied, sealed with wax or cloth, and the wooden boxes with their small painted labels. The labels mattered. Memory was trusted, but memory could fail. A serious apothecary labeled everything. The Latin names, often, or the common name in the local tongue, spelled in the particular way the writer had learned it. These labels sometimes outlasted the people who wrote them, staying legible for decades, the handwriting becoming an artifact. Inside those jars were powders, pressed petals, small dried berries, dark as dried blood, pieces of bark. Certain minerals, sulfur, perhaps, pale yellow as old candle wax. The contents were measured by weight, using small brass scales that sat on the central table. The weights were kept in a cloth-lined box. They were treated with the same care a carpenter gave a good blade. Measurements mattered because dosing mattered. This was something the medieval healer understood more precisely than we sometimes give them credit for. More was not always better. Certain plants that brought sleep in small amounts could bring something far more serious in larger ones. The healer knew this. They had learned it from the manuscript, or from a teacher, or from one frightening experience long ago that they had never repeated. The infirmary was a separate space, larger, quieter still, usually on the ground floor, where it was easier to carry someone who could not walk. In a well-established castle, this room might have several beds. Simple frames, row-latticed, with straw pallets and wool covers. The walls were thick. The temperature in summer was cool. In winter, a small brazier could be lit. The warmth was careful, considered, because too much heat was thought to worsen certain illnesses. Light was kept low for those who were suffering. When someone in the castle fell seriously ill, there was a question that had to be answered quickly. Was this something the household healer could manage, or did it require the monastery? Many castles maintained a relationship with the nearest religious house. The monks and nuns of certain orders had long traditions of medical learning. The infirmaries of the great monasteries were, in many ways, the most sophisticated medical spaces in the medieval world. They kept extensive herb gardens. They copied and studied the old texts. They had the patience for long, careful work and the quiet that serious healing seemed to require. A messenger would ride out, a monk might come, or if the patient could be moved, they would be carried to the monastery, where the infirmarian would take charge with his own shelves, his own certainty, his own methods. But not every illness called for that. most did not. The everyday work of the castle's healer was quieter than crisis. It was the persistent cough that had settled into a traveling merchant sleeping in the guest chamber. It was the stiff and painful knees of the steward, who was growing older and had noticed it most in cold weather. It was the restless nights of a young child in the household, and the mother who came with tired eyes asking if there was anything. There was usually something. A preparation of chamomile for sleep, steeped, strained, the liquid pale gold, with a smell that was soft and slightly apple-sweet. A poultice of comfrey laid warm against a swollen joint, the leaves made into a soft, dark paste that smelled of the riverbank in summer. Feverfew for the headache that arrived behind the eyes and spread. Thyme mixed with honey and a little warm water for the tight chest and the rattling cough. Honey was important. It appeared in preparations constantly. In those days, honey was understood to have preserving properties, and it did, genuinely. It kept remedies from spoiling. It made bitter medicines more likely to be taken. It was soothing on its own, poured warm over a raw throat, thick and slow, the smell filling the small room completely. The healer worked steadily. There was no urgency in the usual rhythm. The grinding of dried material in the stone mortar made a soft, persistent sound, rhythmic, almost meditational. The pestle moved in slow circles. The powder grew finer. The smell strengthened. Outside, the castle carried on. Footsteps on stone, voices in the courtyard, the distant clatter of the kitchen. In here, none of that was urgent. And then there was the other layer of practice, the one that sat alongside the plant knowledge and the careful dosing, and that cannot be fully separated from it if we want to understand how healing actually felt in those days. Superstition is too simple a word for it. It was more like an old grammar, a set of inherited understandings about how the world was organized, how health moved through it, what forces shaped a body's well-being beyond what could be touched or measured. The moon mattered. The time of year mattered. Plants harvested at midsummer were believed to carry different properties than those cut in other weeks, stronger in some cases. The dew on a plant in early morning was thought to add something. A plant growing near running water was sometimes considered more potent than one growing in dry ground. These beliefs had texture and logic. They were not random. They formed a system, an attempt to make sense of the fact that the same remedy sometimes worked clearly and sometimes seemed to do very little. The difference had to come from somewhere. The harvest time was a reasonable candidate. Certain illnesses were thought to come from imbalance. The old theory of the humors, cold and hot, wet and dry, shaped how a healer thought about what they were doing. A fever was heat in excess. The treatment should therefore bring cooling, cold infusions, certain plants considered to have a cooling nature, rest from exertion, which generated heat. This thinking was systematic. It had an internal consistency. And within that system, the remedies were chosen with a real coherence. It also meant that food was medicine to a degree. What a sick person ate was considered part of their treatment. Light broths rather than heavy meat. Cool water rather than warm, or the reverse, depending on the nature of the illness. The kitchen and the healer's room were not entirely separate worlds. There were also preparations that lived at the edge between remedy and protection. Small bundles of herbs hung above doorways, not primarily for their smell, though the smell was noted and appreciated, but because certain plants were believed to keep illness from entering a room in the first place. Rue was one of these. Strong-smelling, slightly sharp, its small leaves considered to have a kind of warding property. These were serious beliefs held by serious people. The same person who could read Dioscorides in reasonable Latin and measure out a careful preparation by weight. That same person might also hang rue above the lintel of the infirmary without seeing any contradiction. The world was understood as layered. Natural causes and unseen forces could both be real at once. Long after the candle had burned down to its last inch, the healer might still be at the table. The light would be very low by then. The smell of the room would be its richest at night, when the air was still, all the dried things releasing something into the dim air, a dense and complicated smell that was both slightly sharp and deeply comforting. The preparation had to be done carefully, even by the end of a long day, even when the hands were tired, because someone was waiting for it. Someone in the infirmary, lying in the low light, listening to the small sounds of the sleeping castle, or a child in the upper rooms, breathing carefully, the mother sitting close, or the steward who had said nothing but would be grateful tomorrow for the small jar left quietly outside his door. This is what healing was in those days, not dramatic, not certain, mostly patient, careful, slow. It smelled of dried flowers and old wood and honey. It happened in a small room with thick walls and a low ceiling, by candlelight, in the early mornings and the late evenings. The knowledge in it was real. It had been gathered across centuries, tested against countless illnesses, refined and recorded, and passed along through monasteries and households, and the careful conversations between one healer and the next. It was not complete knowledge. It was not always successful, but it was earnest and structured and often kind. By morning, the light through the thick glass would be moving again across the shelves, pale green and slow. The jars sitting in their rows, sealed and labeled. The hanging bundles casting faint shadows on the wall behind them. The manuscript open to the same page it had been open to for days, because that page was the one currently needed. And the room would be quiet. Whatever had been made the night before was made. Whatever had been carried to whoever needed it was already on its way to working or not working, with all the uncertainty that implied. Outside, the castle was waking. The kitchens, the stables, the great hall, all of it beginning again, the long, ordinary machinery of the day. But the still room stayed quiet a little longer. It had its own rhythm, a slower one. The smell lingered there all morning, long after the healer had gone, folding into the cool air and the low light. Chamomile, beeswax from the candle, something earthy beneath it all, like roots brought inside from cold ground. The smell of careful work and old knowledge, and a kind of patience that took a very long time to learn. The wheel of the year turned slowly. It always did. And inside a medieval castle, the turning was felt in the body before it was ever marked on any calendar. Summer came in through the walls, through the narrow windows, through gaps in the stonework that no one had ever fully sealed. The air changed. The light changed. Mornings arrived earlier than anyone expected, and the great hall filled with a pale gold warmth that it never quite held in colder months. Stone, which spent so much of the year hoarding cold, would sit in the long afternoon light and release a kind of dry, mineral warmth, faint, steady, like the exhale of something very old. Midsummer was not a single day. It was a feeling that gathered for weeks. The grass on the hillside below the gatehouse grew tall and slightly wild. Flowers appeared along the outer walls, small, stubborn things that found their way between the stones every year without fail. In those days, people understood the year as a living body. It had its seasons of strength and its seasons of exhaustion. Midsummer was the peak, the moment of fullest breath. Everything leaned toward it. The bonfires came first, always. They were lit on the hills surrounding the castle, sometimes on the castle grounds themselves, in the outer ward where there was room enough and stone enough to keep the flame from spreading. The wood was gathered days in advance. Dry branches, old timber, whatever the estate could spare. By evening on Midsummer's Eve, the piles stood taller than a man, and when they caught fully. Great columns of orange light rising against a sky that never quite darkened, that peculiar deep blue of a northern midsummer night, when the sun has barely gone below the horizon before it begins to think about rising again. People danced near the fires, not the careful, courtly dances of the great hall, but older ones, looser, dances that went in circles that had no particular beginning or end. The church tolerated this uneasily. Priests sometimes came to watch, sometimes came to participate, sometimes simply looked the other way. In those days, the boundary between sacred and pagan was less a wall than a river. The water moved in both directions. It is said that jumping over the bonfire brought protection for the year ahead. It is said the ashes, carried home and scattered on the fields, encouraged good harvest. Whether anyone fully believed these things or simply did them because they had always been done, that is harder to know. Perhaps it did not matter. The doing was the thing. The warmth on your face, the smell of wood smoke in your hair, the night air thick with the scent of cut grass and distant rain. Green boughs were brought inside. This, too, was ancient. Oak branches, elder and sweet-smelling herbs, lavender if it could be found, rosemary if someone had grown it near the kitchen garden. They were hung from the rafters and laid across the long tables. For a few days, the great hall smelled like a forest had walked indoors and made itself comfortable. The dried dust of the rushes on the floor mingled with living green. Something bright and resinous drifted down from the ceiling when a door opened and moved the air. The servants felt midsummer differently than the Lord. They felt it in the length of the working day, those long, relentless hours when the light simply refused to end. There was more to do, more food to prepare, more wood to cut, more fields to tend, more visitors to accommodate, because summer brought movement and movement brought guests. But there was also a looseness to the season, a sense that the rules had shifted slightly, that the year was generous enough to allow a little more. Children ran in the outer ward until late, long past the hour when, in winter, they would have been pulled indoors. The summer dark was mild and soft. Bats moved through it silently, following their own ancient patterns along the walls. A child lying in the grass and looking up would see a sky full of stars slowly assembling themselves as the last light faded. The stone of the castle walls still warm against the back of a hand pressed flat against them. Then the wheel turned again, as it always did. The days shortened slowly at first, then noticeably, then with a kind of urgency that the body registered before the mind did. The light in the great hall shifted from gold to gray. Mornings arrived later. The fire in the central hearth, which had been allowed to breathe low through summer, was built up again, higher, more carefully maintained. The smell of the castle changed. Wood smoke became the dominant note once more. That deep, familiar smell that had been there all along, underneath everything, but now returned to fill every room. Midwinter arrived with its full weight. Snow was not guaranteed, but it was expected. When it came quietly. The narrow windows of the castle showed a changed world outside. The familiar shapes of the outer wards softened and filled, the fields beyond the walls gone white and still. Sound carried differently in snow. A horse's hooves, a voice from the gatehouse, the clang of something dropped in the kitchen yard, all of it reached the ear slightly muffled, slightly changed. The world had put on heavy cloth. Inside, the great hall was being prepared. This took days. The Yule log was the heart of it. In those days, the choosing of the log was taken seriously. It had to be large enough to burn for many days, the whole of the 12 days of feasting, if possible. Ideally, it was oak. Oak burned slow and steady, and gave off a heat that oak's size alone seemed unable to fully explain. Men dragged it in through the great doors with ropes and effort, with shouting and the scrape of bark against the stone floor. It was positioned in the hearth with the same kind of care that a craftsman gives to fitting a cornerstone. And when it caught, when the fire took hold and began its long, slow work, something in the hall relaxed. A collective release of breath. The cold that had been seeping through the walls all day had something to push against now, something with weight and warmth and the steady, amber-colored patience of burning oak. The hall was decorated. Evergreen branches along the walls, holly with its dark leaves and red berries, ivy twisting through the ironwork on the doors, sprigs of something pale and silver-gray that smelled faintly bitter and clean. In those days, the green boughs of midwinter meant something specific. They were proof that life continued, that the world had not fully given itself over to cold and dark, that underneath the snow, the roots were waiting. Candles multiplied. Tallow candles on the long tables, beeswax candles near the high table where the Lord and his family sat. The light they made was warm and unsteady. It moved with every opening of a door, every passing figure, every breath of air that found its way down from the upper floors. Faces in firelight, stone walls pulling the warmth into themselves and holding it. The ceiling of the great hall rising up into shadow, where the carved timbers were barely visible. The 12 days of Christmas were not all feasting, but feasting was at their center. The kitchen had been working toward this for weeks. Stored provisions, the barrels and sacks and dried goods from the autumn's careful work began to move. Spices came out of locked boxes. Pepper, cinnamon, cloves, ginger, things that had traveled enormous distances to reach this cold northern hall, and whose smell was therefore exotic and faintly miraculous. A pinch of nutmeg released into a warm drink on a cold night in a stone hall carries with it half the world's trade routes. In those days, spice meant wealth. It meant the world was larger than the view from the battlements. Meat was roasted on great spits before the fire. The fat dripped and caught and flared. The smell filled the hall completely, rich and heavy and slightly sweet from whatever had been rubbed into the skin before cooking. Bread was baked in quantities that kept the kitchen fires burning day and night. Pies with thick, pale crusts. Sweet dishes made with honey and dried fruit and nuts. The texture of a feast table at midwinter, the crowded dishes, the gleam of fat and candlelight on pewter and wood, the steam rising from platters, was a kind of abundance that the rest of the year made meaningful. Music was part of it. Simple instruments, a lute, a hand drum, perhaps a set of pipes. The music of a medieval great hall at midwinter was not polished entertainment. It was communal and slightly rough and came in waves. A song begun at one end of the table that everyone eventually joined. The overlap of voices, not quite together, finding their rhythm late and then holding it. Children asleep in corners, wrapped in their cloaks, near enough to the fire that the warmth reached them, but not near enough to be woken by the noise. Long after the formal feast was done, people stayed near the fire. There was nowhere else as warm. The great Yule log still burned, patient and enormous, its surface showing a shifting landscape of coals and white ash and deep orange, where the fire still worked its way inward. The smell of it was clean and heavy at once. Wood smoke and hot stone and the faint sweetness of rendered tallow from the guttering candles. Old stories came out at midwinter. They always did. Some were saints' lives, some were older. Stories about the dark returning, about the world holding still at the solstice, and then, very slowly, tipping back toward light. Stories about things that walked in the long nights. About doors that should not be left open in the 12 days. About places in the forest that changed their nature when the year reached its turning point. The church had its own version of all of this, and underneath it, the older version persisted, not in opposition to the church calendar, but woven through it like roots through soil. In those days, superstition and faith were not opposites. They shared the same house. A woman who lit a candle in the chapel at Christmastide, and then, on the same evening, placed a bowl of bread and salt on the doorstep for reasons her grandmother had taught her. She saw no contradiction. Both felt necessary. Both belonged to the same understanding of a world that had its unseen layers and needed to be managed carefully. The 12 days moved at a different pace than ordinary time. The usual rhythms were suspended. Work was reduced. Arguments were set aside, or at least deferred. Guests were welcomed even if the hall was already full. There was a generosity to midwinter feasting that reflected something practical as much as something ceremonial. The year had been survived, the harvest was in, the fires were burning. That was worth marking. Children slept near the hearth in the great hall because the warmth was there, and because the evening had been long and the food had been plentiful, and at some point the body simply gives in. Their breathing slowed, their faces smoothed. The fire made its own sounds, the tick and settle of the great log, the occasional soft collapse of a piece of burning timber falling inward. The shadows moved on the walls. Snow fell silently outside the narrow windows. The oldest people in the hall had seen many of these midwinters. 40, perhaps 50, if they had lived long, each one different in its particulars and the same in its shape. The same smell of smoke and spice and burned fat. The same weight of the dark outside. The same sense that the year had arrived at its deepest, coldest, longest point, and would slowly begin to move again. It always did. The wheel turned. The light would return. The spring would come again with its own smells and sounds and particular quality of air. But for now, in the hall, with the Yule log burning down and the candles low, there was no need to hurry toward any of that. The cold would hold a while longer. The dark was still generous with its hours, and in the warmth of the fire, beneath the hanging green boughs, surrounded by the smell of old stone and new smoke, and something sweet from the kitchen that had not quite burned away, the castle rested. Its people rested with it, patient as roots in cold ground, waiting for the long turning to begin again. Not every castle held a library. Many had none at all. The great hall held weapons and furniture and the noise of daily life, and that was enough for most. But in some castles, the grander ones or the more learned ones, there was a smaller room, a quieter room, one that smelled of dust and tallow and something older than either. It was called the Scriptorium in the formal sense of the word. In practice, it was often just a chamber off the chapel or a narrow alcove near the Lord's private quarters, a slanted desk, a stool, a shelf or two built into the stone wall. Perhaps a chest with an iron lock, where the most important documents were kept flat and dry and safe from damp. The window was small. It had to be. Glass was expensive, and cold air was the enemy of ink. In winter, the clerk worked by the light of a single candle, tilted close to the page. The flame shivered when someone passed outside in the corridor. The clerk did not look up. By the time the rest of the castle was settling towards sleep, this room was often still at work. The candle burned low on its holder. The wax pooled softly in the cold. Outside, if it was autumn or deep winter, rain would find the narrow gap around the wooden shutter and lay a faint smell of wet stone across the room. It blended with the ink and the vellum and the particular still air that builds wherever words are kept. There was always a clerk, a man almost without exception in those days. He had usually been trained in a monastery or had come from a family with some tradition of letters. He knew Latin, He knew the particular abbreviations used in legal documents. He knew how to write a hand that was clear and even and slow, a hand that could be read 20 years later or 100 without confusion. He would arrive at the desk early, before proper light, and check what was needed. Perhaps a letter for the Lord to send to a neighboring estate. Perhaps the copying of a land deed, a second version for the castle's own records. Perhaps the continuation of an account roll, a long, narrow strip of parchment listing rents received, grain measured, animals bought and sold. These rolls could run to many feet when unrolled on the floor. They were the memory of the castle's wealth, and they had to be exact. He sharpened his quill with a small knife kept at the edge of the desk. This was not a quick act. The nib had to be cut just so, a fine split at the tip, the angle precise. Too blunt and the line would thicken and blur. Too sharp and the vellum would catch and tear. He tested the nib on a scrap of skin, drew a few marks, checked the line. Then he dipped and began. The sound of a quill on vellum is very particular. It is not quite scratching, though people call it that. It is closer to a soft drag, a smooth, deliberate motion that occasionally catches on a rough patch of skin and skips. The sound was small in that room. It was the only sound, most nights, apart from the rain and the low burn of the candle. The vellum itself deserves a moment of thought. It was not paper. It would not be paper for centuries yet. It was the skin of a calf, or sometimes a lamb, scraped thin on a wooden frame while still damp, dried under tension, then scraped again. The finished surface was pale and very smooth, slightly translucent near the edges where the skin had been thinnest. It had a faint warmth in the hand. Laid on the desk in a sheet, it seemed almost to glow in candlelight. The making of a single sheet of vellum required care and time and the life of a young animal. This was simply understood. No one in those days would have found it remarkable. The calf had been born and raised on the castle lands or purchased at market. Its skin was useful as its meat had been useful. Waste was not a luxury the medieval world could afford. The ink was another matter, another small craft within the larger craft of writing. The most common ink was made from oak galls. These are the round, hard growths that form on oak trees when certain wasps lay their eggs beneath the bark. Crushed and soaked in water, then combined with iron sulfate and a small amount of gum arabic to help it bind to the surface, the mixture produced an ink of extraordinary durability. It dried to a dark brown-black. It resisted fading for centuries. It is still legible today in documents that have survived fire and flood and the indifference of time. The clerk mixed it himself, in small batches, in a ceramic pot kept warm near the candle. On cold nights, the ink thickened and moved sluggishly. He would hold the pot briefly in both hands, warming it before dipping again. For the initial letters, the large ornamental capitals that opened a new section or a new chapter, there was red ochre, ground to powder and mixed separately. Some castles of means had clerks who could manage more than this. Blue from lapis lazuli, a deeper red from a dried insect called kermes, imported at great expense. Small touches of gold leaf, pressed onto a tacky base and burnished smooth with a dog's tooth. But these things required skill beyond the ordinary, and time and cost. The average castle clerk worked mostly in oak gall brown and the occasional, careful red. What was kept on those shelves? It varied enormously from one castle to the next. There were, almost always, the practical documents, the account rolls, the deeds, the rental agreements. These were not books in the romantic sense of the word. They were functional objects, used and consulted and occasionally disputed in court. They smelled of necessity, but in some castles there were also books. Bound manuscripts, stitched at the spine and wrapped in leather covers, that had darkened with handling. A psalter, most commonly, the Book of Psalms, used for daily prayer, often beautifully made, a gift perhaps from a bishop or a wealthy relation. A Book of Hours, with its cycle of prayers for each part of the day. A herbal listing the properties of plants, which root reduced fever, which leaf soothed a wound, which bark was dangerous in quantity. This last was a working book. It was consulted by the lady of the castle, or by the cook, or by whoever had the care of the sick. There were sometimes romances, stories of heroes and love and distant kingdoms, copied by hand from older copies, passed between households like gifts. The stories of Arthur were already old by the high medieval period. So were the tales of Charlemagne. These books were read aloud in the great hall in the evenings to whoever wished to listen. They wore the evidence of this on their pages, stains at the corners, worn edges, the occasional marginal note in a different hand. Someone had been here before. Someone had read this passage and paused. A letter was different again. Letters arrived at the castle folded and sealed with wax, the Lord's own seal pressed into it, or a bishop's or a merchant's mark. The clerk would sometimes receive these and record their contents before they were delivered. He would also draft the replies, writing out a clean copy for the Lord's seal and keeping a rough version for the castle's own memory. In those days, a letter could take weeks to arrive. It traveled with a messenger on horseback across roads that became rivers in wet weather. It passed through the hands of strangers at night, stored in a leather satchel against the rain. When it arrived, it was often slightly battered. The wax seal might be chipped. The vellum might have absorbed a faint smell of horse sweat and road, but the words were intact, and the words were what mattered. A letter was a thread, thin but real, connecting the castle to the world beyond its walls. News of a marriage in a distant county, a request for men or money, a warning about a disputed boundary. The formalities were elaborate. Letters opened with careful phrases of respect and deference, naming the recipient's titles before the writer's own, establishing the hierarchy before saying anything of substance. The clerk knew these formulas by heart. He had written them so many times they came without thought, the way a prayer comes without thought. He sat at his desk now, in the deep quiet of the night, finishing something, perhaps a copy of a deed that had to be sealed before morning. Perhaps the final entry on this season's account roll. The candle was low. He had maybe an hour of good light left. He wrote steadily, his posture slightly bent, his left hand resting flat on the vellum to keep it from lifting in the draft. The room was warm, warmer than it looked. The candle gave off more heat than you might expect in such a small space. The stone walls, which had absorbed the cold all day, were beginning to give it back slowly. The clerk did not feel it particularly. He had learned to be still for long hours, still and attentive and patient. This kind of patience is its own particular quality. It is not waiting for something to happen. It is the opposite, the deliberate slowing of oneself to match the pace of careful work. Each letter formed with intention, each line begun and finished cleanly. There was satisfaction in this that had nothing to do with speed or urgency. The satisfaction was in the exactness, in the correspondence between what the letter should look like and what it did look like, there on the pale surface of the skin. Long after the clerk had gone to bed, the room held its quiet. The candle had burned down to its stub, or been snuffed with a small brass cone. The manuscripts on the shelves rested in the dark. Rolled documents lay in their wooden tubes or tied with thin leather strips. Bound books leaned against each other, covers soft with age. They held between them a great deal of the castle's memory, the names of tenants from 2 generations past, the price of wool in a year when the harvest failed, a description of the castle's boundaries written in careful Latin, citing oak trees and streams as landmarks, some of which no longer existed. The boundary line had been redrawn around trees that had been cut long since, streams that had shifted or dried, and there were the stories, the romances in their worn covers, the saints' lives with their measured, formal prose, the psalms that had been read aloud so many times the pages had softened at the edges, almost velvety now, the way worn cloth becomes soft. These objects were, in a sense, the most fragile things in the castle. Stone lasted, iron lasted, but a book required a specific kind of care, dry air, steady handling, a room that did not flood or burn. Many castles lost their documents in a single night of fire. Others lost them more slowly, to damp, to neglect, to the scattering that came after a family line ended and the servants left and the doors were locked and no one came back. But some survived. Some were moved carefully when a family moved. Some were given to monasteries for safekeeping. Some were copied again, years later, by another clerk in another room, a different candle throwing the same uncertain light across the same pale vellum. The act of copying was itself a kind of preservation, a decision made over and over that these words were worth the time and the calfskin and the ink, that this record should exist, that this story should continue. It was not a dramatic decision. It was made quietly at a slanted desk in a small room off the chapel while the rest of the castle slept. The quill moved, the ink dried, the words remained. Outside, the rain had eased. The night settled deeper into itself. The manuscripts in their dark room stood in their neat row on the shelf, patient and still, holding everything they had been given to hold. The watchman moved slowly. He always did at this hour. There was no reason to hurry. The castle was still, and the stillness had a weight to it, a settled, gathered kind of quiet that pressed gently against the ears. His name is lost. It was always lost. Men who walked the night watch left very little behind them in the written records, because the written records were kept by men who slept. But he was there. Someone was always there. That was the point. He carried a lantern, a small one fitted with a horn panel so the flame was softened and diffused. It threw a pale circle of amber light on the stone flags ahead of him, and beyond that circle, the world was dark. Not the dark of a room with shutters closed, the dark of a world that had genuinely put itself to sleep. He began, as he always did, in the great hall. The fire had been banked hours before. Someone whose duty it was had raked the coals into a tight mound and covered them with ash, so they would hold through the night without burning freely. A faint orange glow still lived inside that mound. You could see it if you stood close enough. A deep, internal pulse, like something breathing very slowly beneath a blanket of gray. The heat still lingered in the air near the hearth. Not warmth, exactly, the memory of warmth. The stones themselves had absorbed it through the long day, and now they were releasing it back, very gradually, into the cooling air. The whole sleepers lay where they had fallen. There is no better word for it. They had been given their places, near the fire, along the walls, some on the rushes, some on low wooden frames, and they had laid themselves down and gone under. A dozen of them, perhaps more. Men whose exact duties are difficult to name at this distance. Servants, retainers, men whose lives were bound up entirely with the household, who had no other place to be. One of them snored. It was a long, slow, deeply contented sound. The watchman had heard it every night for years. He no longer noticed it, the way you stop noticing a river if you live beside one long enough. Another man lay with his arm thrown over his eyes, as if even in sleep he was guarding himself against a light that was not there. A boy, young, perhaps 14, lay curled on his side with his knees drawn up, his hands folded under his cheek, his face entirely slack and open and unguarded. Sleep does that. It removes the effort people carry in their faces during waking hours. In those days, people carried a great deal of effort. The watchman moved through without disturbing anyone. His steps were quiet. He had learned, over years of this, how to place his feet on stone so that the sound barely registered. He passed through the hall the way water passes through a room, present and then gone. He checked the door that led to the kitchens. It was closed, as it should be. He pressed a hand against it briefly, feeling for heat. There was none beyond the faint ambient warmth that persisted in all the stones near the hall. The kitchen fires, too, had been put down for the night. The spits were still. The heavy iron pots had been scoured and set aside. The whole long labor of feeding a household had been suspended until morning. Through the gap under the door came a smell, fat and old smoke, and the faint sweetness of something baked earlier in the day, bread or something close to it. The smell had nowhere to go. It had settled into the kitchen like a residue, like proof of all the hours that had passed inside those walls. He moved on. The stairways in a castle at night are among the strangest places in the world. They are narrow and they spiral, and the lantern throws shadows that move at different speeds than the man carrying it. A shadow will precede you up a stair by several steps, and then wait for you at the turn, and then slide away again. You learn not to think too carefully about this. The stone of the walls in the stairwell was cool to the touch. Not cold, not yet. That would come later, nearer to dawn, when the temperature fell its final few degrees, and every surface in the castle became slightly damp. But at midnight, the stone was merely cool, faintly gritty under the fingertips, dressed with that characteristic texture, not smooth, never quite smooth, always with the memory of the chisel preserved in it somewhere. He passed a door he knew led to a small chamber. Inside, a child slept. He could hear nothing, but he knew, the way you know such things when you have walked the same route long enough. He slowed his step, without thinking about it, just there, and then walked on. The stables were outside the main tower, accessible through a low door that opened onto the inner courtyard. He pulled this door carefully, easing the iron latch so it settled back without a sound, and stepped outside. The cold arrived immediately. Not aggressive, this was not that kind of cold. It was a still cold, a settled cold, the kind that simply exists in the air without movement. He felt it on his face. His breath appeared before him as a pale cloud and dissolved. The courtyard was dark. His lantern seemed very small against it. The walls rose around him on all sides, and above the walls there was the sky, and the sky was extraordinary. He looked up, as he always looked up at this hour. It was not something he thought about. It was simply what you did, stepping into the open at midnight under a clear sky. You looked up. There were more stars than there are words for. In those days, there were no other lights. No distant glow from a town, no orange haze on the horizon, nothing competing. The sky was what the sky actually was, a vast, deeply black field, and in it, suspended at every scale and depth, stars beyond any reasonable counting. The bright ones burned with a steadiness that seemed almost audible. The faint ones could only be seen at the edges of the eye, gone when you looked directly at them. The Milky Way, though he would not have called it that, spread across the dome of the sky like a river of pale light, a smear of accumulated stars so densely packed they blurred into one another. He had looked at it all his life. He would never have described it to anyone. Some things were simply there, simply part of the given fabric of a night, like the cold on his face or the sound of his own breathing. He crossed the courtyard. His footsteps clicked on the stone, very clean and precise in the silence. The stables were warm. This was always a small relief. The horses, there were several, and they had their own careful hierarchy and arrangement, generated a tremendous heat collectively. The building held it. The smell was dense and close and not unpleasant. Hay and dung, and the particular warm animal smell of a horse's neck when you press your face near it. Lanolin and grain, and something deeper and older. The horses were quiet. Most of them were standing. Horses sleep on their feet when they feel safe, and these horses were safe. One shifted its weight as the watchman passed, a slow rocking from one side to the other, its eyes half closed. The sound of the shift was soft hooves on straw, a creak of wood from the stall partition, then quiet again. A gray horse near the end of the row turned its head toward the lantern. Just that. It looked with one large, dark, utterly composed eye, and then looked away again. The eye was wet with reflected light for just a moment. Then the horse turned back to whatever a horse faces inward toward at midnight, whatever that is. The watchman came back out into the cold. The battlements were reached by a stair on the far side of the inner wall, a different stair, external, exposed to the sky on one side. He climbed it carefully. The steps were worn in the center, worn in the way that speaks to centuries of feet, hundreds of thousands of trips up and down this same arc of stone. The wear was almost soft to the touch, almost like something organic. At the top, the cold changed. Up here, there was the faintest suggestion of a breeze, not enough to be called wind, enough to feel. He felt it on his ears and on the back of his hands where they were exposed, and in his eyes, which watered slightly and then adjusted. The wall walk stretched away in both directions. The battlements stood at chest height, the merlons, the solid sections, alternating with the gaps. Through the gaps you could see out across the land, and at midnight in winter, the land was also dark, not entirely. Moonlight laid a faint silver quality across the fields and the tree line. Frost, probably on the higher ground, catching what light there was. The world below the walls was silver gray and completely still, extending outward until it lost itself in the dark. He walked the wall walk slowly. He always walked it slowly. This was the longest part of the round and the coldest, and in certain weathers the hardest. But tonight it was simply still. His lantern swung slightly as he walked, throwing its amber light forward and back with each step, finding the stones, finding the worn places he already knew. There were things to listen for. He knew what they were. He had done this long enough to know the difference between a sound that meant something and a sound that meant nothing. An owl somewhere in the trees beyond the outer wall. Distant. Its call came 3 times, evenly spaced, and then nothing. A horse, very faintly, from the stable below, not distress, just the small sounds of a large animal rearranging itself in sleep. Nothing that meant anything, only the ordinary sounds of a castle at rest. He stopped at the farthest point of his walk and stood for a moment. This was not required of him. There was no duty that said, "Stand here and be still." But he stood anyway. The sky above him was everything. The stars were old. Centuries before this castle was built, those same stars had looked down on people standing in this same cold, drawing the same breath, feeling the same small, steady heartbeat in their own chests. The stars did not change on any time scale that mattered to a man standing on a wall. They were the oldest thing visible from any point on Earth. He stood, and he breathed, and he looked. It is not recorded what men like him thought about in moments like this. The records do not reach to that, but the moment itself is knowable. The cold on the face, the breath coming and going, the faint creak of leather as he shifted his weight. The lantern resting on the battlement beside him, its small flame burning very calmly inside its horn housing, yellow and steady and warm. The stone under his hands, slightly roughened, entirely solid, carrying in its grain the accumulated cold of the night. Below him, the castle breathed. The whole sleepers turned and did not wake. The banked fire held its patient glow inside its mound of ash. The manuscripts stood in their dark room. The horses stood in their warm dark. The child behind the door slept on, unaware of the cold above, unaware of the stars, unaware of the watchman standing on the wall looking up at them. The day had been long, as days in those places were always long. It had begun before light, and it had filled itself with every kind of labor, fire and bread and water and iron and leather and stone and ink, and the endless, necessary work of keeping a large household alive and ordered and fed. All of that was done now. All of it had settled into the past, the way everything settles eventually into the past. Long after midnight, the breeze dropped entirely. The cold deepened by 1 more degree. The stars turned imperceptibly in their ancient courses. The watchman picked up his lantern. He turned. He began the slow walk back along the wall toward the stair. The castle slept on beneath him, and above it, the stars, ancient and indifferent and beautiful, kept their long, unhurried watch over everything.